He was the man your nightmares never warned you about, because even monsters wear wedding rings and bring home groceries. But behind the smile was a silence so cold, it could freeze time itself. Not all monsters wait under your bed. Some stand in the kitchen, humming low, the way a father might. Some monsters kiss their wives on the cheek before pouring cereal into a bowl for the kids. Some monsters wear slippers. Richard Kuklinski did not come into this world snarling. He arrived quiet, blinking again. He was born in Jersey City, a place where brick walls swallowed heat in summer and spat it back out in winter. His home, like many on the block, had walls too thin to hold back shouting, too thick to let in help. The voices that filled the space weren't lessons or lullabies. They were the sound of fear rehearsed daily. His father, Stanley, was a brute in human form, a railroad worker with fists like concrete and a temper that came with no fuse. He didn't yell first, he hit first, then yelled after. His mother, Anna, taught religion by day and begged for silence by night. Devotion was her only defense. She'd clutch her rosary tight enough to leave marks on her palms, whispering prayers that never seemed to reach the ceiling. And then there was Richard, a boy with big eyes and a stillness that unnerved even other children. He didn't cry like his siblings. He watched, he listened, he took notes inside a mind, already learning that emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford. Sometimes he flinched at the wrong moments. Once, his father beat him so badly that Richard's brother thought he was dead. They kept it quiet. That's what families did back then. But Richard remembered, the linoleum cold under his cheek, the sound of his mother saying, "You shouldn't make your father angry." Not why he did it. Just don't make him angry. He learned early that monsters don't need fangs. They just need to be the last voice you hear before you fall asleep, and the first one you hear when your dreams start to flee. At school, he was quiet, not shy, just distant, like he had learned the truth too soon and no longer needed fairy tales. Teachers said he was polite. Polite can mean a lot of things. In Richard's case, it meant invisible. There's a kind of silence that isn't empty. It waits, it watches, and when it grows up, it learns to walk beside you without making a sound. Richard Kuklinski didn't roar. He never needed to. His quiet did the screaming for him. And in that silence, a question began to form, not, "Why do they hurt me?" but, "How do they get away with it?" And someday soon, he would answer that. Not with words, with action. The windows never quite closed right in that Jersey City apartment. Cold leaked in during winter and let the noise out during summer, but no one ever came to check. Broken glass was just part of the background, like peeling wallpaper or the sound of sirens fading into the distance. In that house, silence wasn't peace, it was warning. The kind of silence that came just before a slap or after a scream. Richard grew up learning which floorboards creaked and which ones you avoided when your father was drinking. He learned how to tell time not by clocks, but by footsteps. Fast meant angry, slow meant something worse. His brother flinched too much. His mother prayed too much. And Richard watched it all. Stanley Kuklinski didn't believe in second chances. He believed in hard hands and hollow words, a father figure in name only. The man came home smelling of train grease and bitterness, with a belt that did more talking than he ever did. Sometimes it was the back of the hand, sometimes a broomstick, sometimes just that dead-eyed stare that froze the room. And when the bruises faded, no one asked questions. In those neighborhoods, everyone had their own bruises to deal with. Teachers didn't press. Neighbors looked away. The world was too busy surviving to notice one boy slipping into silence. At night, Richard would lie in bed and stare at the ceiling, not dreaming, just counting, listening to the breathing from the next room, hoping his father passed out on the couch instead of making it upstairs, hoping his mother wouldn't cry too loud, hoping the baby didn't wake up. Hope didn't last long in that house. One time, the family cat disappeared. A few days later, Richard saw it in a trash bag behind the building. No one spoke about it. No one ever spoke about anything. The house was full of secrets buried beneath layers of routine. Eat, flinch, pray, pretend. That's how bruises multiply. In the body, in the mind. He didn't tell anyone when his brother Joey started hurting animals. Didn't say anything when his mother left and came back with bruises of her own. Because in that house, silence wasn't just survival. It was inheritance. Years later, people would ask how someone like Richard could become what he became, as if monsters are made overnight. But monsters grow slowly. In the dark, behind broken windows. Inside bruised silence. Fed not by rage but by repetition, Richard learned that fear could be hidden under politeness, that pain could be buried deep without ever healing, and that sometimes, to stay alive, you had to become colder than the fists that raised you. And so he did. Stanley Kuklinski didn't drink because he was broken. He drank because it made him feel whole. A man with nothing but his fists and a job on the railroad, Stanley came home every night looking for something to hit that couldn't hit back. And he never had to look far. There was always a child too slow to move, or a wife too tired to argue. His violence wasn't random. It was ritual. Predictable in the same way Sunrise Island. Something terrible you could see coming, but never stop. Richard learned early that love didn't live in that house. Only obedience. The kind that came with swollen lips and silent meals. Stanley didn't lecture. He didn't explain. He just acted. If a dish broke, if a coat wasn't hung right, if a voice dared get loud, the punishment came like weather. Sudden, inevitable, and with it, the knowledge that being right didn't mean being safe. Once, Stanley beat Richard so hard, the boy stopped breathing for a moment. His mother screamed, his brother cried. Stanley said nothing. He stood over the body of his son with that same cold look, as if waiting to see if Richard would get back up or stay down forever. When he finally moved, Stanley didn't apologize. He went to the fridge and opened a beer. There are things that never leave a child. Moments that press themselves into bone, into the wiring behind the eyes. That was one of them. Richard never forgot the way the room spun. The copper taste of blood. The blank stare of a man who called himself father and acted like a butcher. He never forgot the way his mother looked at him afterward, more relieved than loving, as if death had flirted with him and walked away. Some say monsters are born. Others say they're made. But Richard learned something different. Sometimes, monsters are taught, not with words, but with examples, with hands, with bruises that turn yellow by morning. Stanley was a teacher of silence. He taught Richard that weakness was dangerous, that kindness was a risk, that the only way to stay safe was to stay harder than the man who hurt you. And over time, that hardness became armor. Then it became habit. Then it became Richard. Years later, when Richard himself became feared, when people whispered about the Iceman and the bodies left behind, some asked what made him that way. They wanted to trace it back to a trigger, a moment, a crack. But Richard didn't crack. He was carved, carefully, repeatedly, and Stanley held the chisel. In the end, Richard didn't become a monster despite his father. He became one because of him. There's always a first time. The first time pain doesn't make you cry. The first time fear knocks and you don't answer. The first time you stop being prey and start becoming something else. For Richard, that moment came not with a scream, but with silence. Not from a man, but from a dog. It was a neighbor's mutt. Mean, hungry, always tied to a rusted fence with too little chain and too much attitude. Richard was still just a boy, then tall for his age, quiet as always, with hands he didn't quite know how to use yet. He walked past that dog every day, on his way to the corner store or school, and every day the dog lunged and barked and snapped at the air like it hated the whole world. Maybe it did. Maybe it saw something in Richard that it recognized. One afternoon, something in him shifted. He wasn't angry. He wasn't scared. He just stopped walking. The dog barked louder, pulling against the chain, froth on its mouth, claws kicking up dust. Richard looked at it and didn't move. He stood there, staring into its eyes, and for the first time in his life, he didn't flinch. Then he turned, picked up a broken piece of cinder block. His hands didn't shake. His heart didn't race. He walked forward. The dog barked once more, and then he swung. Once, then twice, then again. When he was done, there was no noise, no barking, just the sound of chain dragging across concrete. He stood over the body, breathing through his nose, eyes blank, not triumphant, not ashamed, just still. Some part of him thought he might feel better, lighter, stronger, but instead, he felt nothing, not cold, not hot, just the same as before. The difference was that now he knew what he could do, and what he could do was stop fear from barking. The neighbors never said anything. His father didn't notice the blood on his shirt. His mother was too busy praying for a different kind of miracle. But Richard remembered the weight of the cinder block, the hollow thud, the way silence returned after the storm. That was the first time he didn't flinch, and after that, he never did again. It wasn't about cruelty. Not yet. It wasn't even about power. It was about control. Control over something that once scared him. Control over noise, over chaos, over life. The chain didn't snap. Richard did. And from that day forward, nothing that growled at him ever growled twice. The colder he got, the safer he felt. Not from the world, but from himself. Richard Kuklinski learned early that emotions were dangerous. Not just because they made you weak, but because they made you visible. Cry, and someone laughed. Flinch, and someone swung. Feel too much, and sooner or later, it would get used against you. So he stopped feeling, or at least, stopped showing it. By the time he was a teenager, Richard had already started building a mask. Not one of charm or smiles, just silence, stillness. People stopped picking fights with him because they couldn't read him. He didn't blink when others did, didn't laugh when he was supposed to. He sat at the back of the room and made the air colder around him, just by being there. He found out something else too. That cold wasn't just a shield, it was a weapon. Once, a man insulted him at a pool hall, some joke about his size, something about his clothes. Richard didn't yell, didn't even raise his voice. He waited, followed the man outside into the alley, and then he beat him until the man stopped making sounds. Not out of rage, just necessity. Then he walked away, breathing steady. Later, when someone asked him how he could do things like that, Richard said something simple. It's easier if you don't feel. He meant it. The cold helped him disappear in plain sight. When friends from the neighborhood started getting into small-time crime, stealing radios, moving fake watches, Richard joined in without speaking much. He didn't care about status or money. He liked the structure, the predictability, the way the job didn't ask him how he felt. He learned how to carry himself, how to nod at the right people, how to make others uncomfortable without lifting a finger. And when things went bad, when someone needed to vanish, he learned how to make that happen too. First came fists, then blades, then fire, then freezers. Years later, when the world would call him the Iceman, they thought it was because of how he stored bodies. But the truth went deeper than that. The freezing started long before the killings. It started when he was a boy, staring at the ceiling, trying not to cry. It started when he realized feelings got you hurt, and silence kept you breathing. The ice wasn't in the tools. It was in the heart. He didn't mourn the men he buried. He didn't gloat either. He treated death like he treated everything else, a task, not a tragedy. And the colder he became, the fewer things could touch him. Emotions made people vulnerable. Richard Kuklinski chose armor. And that armor was ice. There were things in the Kuklinski house that no one ever talked about. Not because they were forgotten, but because they were buried. Buried like broken bones under floorboards. Buried like screams behind locked doors. Some families passed down recipes. Others passed down silence. Richard's younger brother, Joseph, was quiet too. But not in the same way. Richard's silence was a shield. Joseph's was something darker, something coiled, tense, like he was always listening to something no one else could hear. He was strange, even by Kuklinski standards, kept to himself, rarely smiled, would disappear for hours and come back with scratches on his arms, dirt under his nails, and a look that dared anyone to ask. No one ever did. The basement was where Joseph liked to go. That dim, cement-walled room that always smelled like mildew and motor oil. Richard didn't go down there often, neither did their mother. The light bulb flickered, and the wooden stairs groaned with every step. But Joseph seemed to love it, spent entire afternoons there. Sometimes you'd hear soft noises coming up through the vents, something like whispering, something like whimpering, and one day, it wasn't just a sound. They found a cat, or what was left of it, in a cardboard box behind the furnace, strangled, burned, taped shut. Richard didn't say a word. His mother didn't scream. His father didn't even blink. Just looked at it like trash and told Richard to clean it up. That was the rule in that house. If something was broken, don't ask who did it. Just throw it away. If someone screamed, close your door. If you found something that made your skin crawl, pretend it wasn't there. That's how you survived. Years later, when Joseph was arrested for killing a young girl, tortured her, then threw her body off a rooftop, no one in the family acted surprised. Shocked, maybe, but not surprised. It was like they had all known something like this would happen. The signs had been there for years, in the basement, in the silence, in the things they refused to name. Richard never cried over it. He never visited his brother in prison. But he remembered. Not the headlines, not the trial, just that box in the basement, the way it smelled, the way it sat there, quiet as a secret. Some families teach each other how to love. The Kuklinskis taught each other how to look away. And in that darkness, two brothers grew up. One became a killer for hire, the other, a predator without a cause. Different paths, same roots, because in that house, the worst crimes didn't happen in the open. They happened in whispers. They happened in basements, and no one ever spoke. The boy's name is long gone now, lost somewhere in the cracks of old sidewalks and rusted fences. But Richard remembered his face, the way he laughed, high and sharp, like a knife scraping glass. The way he pointed at Richard's clothes, or the way he walked, or the way he kept quiet when others shouted. In that neighborhood, you either barked first or got bitten. And Richard didn't bark. Not back then. The boy had cornered him behind the school once, threw rocks, called him names that stung more because they sounded like echoes from home, words his father used, words his mother cried through. That was the first time Richard felt it, not fear, not sadness, but heat. A deep, slow burn that sat behind the eyes and clenched the fists without asking. But he walked away. For a while, a few days later, he saw the boy again walking along the river, near the old tracks, where no one really paid attention. The place smelled like oil and dead leaves. The air felt heavier there, like it knew what was coming. Richard didn't plan it, not the way people think. He didn't wake up that morning with murder on his mind. But when he saw the pipe lying by the edge of the path, rusted and hollow, and when he saw the boy alone, something in him clicked, not snapped, clicked. He picked it up, walked toward the boy. No words, no threats, just motion. The first swing was fast, the second was heavier. By the third, the boy stopped making sounds. There was no screaming, just the wet crunch of something fragile giving way. Richard stood over him for a moment, breathing quiet, not panicked, not smiling, just still. He dragged the body to the riverbank. The current was slow but steady. He watched the water take him like it took everything else in that part of town. Garbage, secrets, names, and then he walked home. He ate dinner with his mother that night. Said nothing. Slept better than he had in weeks. That was the first time. And it didn't feel like he thought it would. It wasn't thunder or guilt or shaking hands. It was quiet, clean, like a page being turned. The boy never came back to school. People muttered. Police asked questions, but no one looked at Richard. He was just the tall, quiet kid with the empty eyes, the one who didn't start trouble. He'd learned something that day. Bullies bleed too, and rivers forget. It wouldn't be his last time, but it would always be the first. They sent him to Catholic school thinking it might fix him, that maybe stained glass and scripture could reach places fists and fear couldn't. The nuns said God watched everything, that he saw into your heart. But Richard Kuklinski had already decided something else. If God had been watching, he hadn't done a damn thing. The uniforms itched. The prayers felt hollow. The sermons floated past him like smoke. The other kids recited verses with practiced rhythm, but Richard never joined in. He mouthed the words. Not because he believed them, but because not mouthing them would raise questions. And he'd learned early that questions were dangerous. The priests talked about sin, about guilt, about burning forever in places below. But guilt was a language Richard never really understood, not even after the river, not even after the pipe. What he felt wasn't regret, it was silence. A deeper silence than even the nuns could pray through. He would sit there in the pews, sunlight catching the dust in the air, and stare at the crucifix, not in awe, not in fear, just curious, wondering how a man nailed to a cross could be called powerful, wondering why this was the symbol of mercy when mercy had never once come through his front door. There was one nun, Sister Margaret, who saw something in him, not warmth, not promise, just stillness. She once pulled him aside after class, looked him in the eye, and asked if he was all right. Just that. One sentence. He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. She didn't ask again. Even she knew the truth. You cannot thaw what was never warm to begin with. At confession, he said what they wanted to hear. Lied about small things. Said he'd taken the Lord's name in vain, or been disrespectful to his mother. Never said anything real. Never mentioned rivers. Never talked about the boy. Never spoke about the dark thoughts that curled in his mind like smoke from a slow fire. And still they told him he was forgiven. He began to realize that confession wasn't about truth. It was about ritual. About saying the right words in the right order and pretending they meant something. He saw through it. Saw that guilt was just another tool used to control people, to keep them scared, and he had spent enough of his life being scared. By the time he left that school, he hadn't lost his faith. He had carved it out, replaced it with something colder, something that didn't need forgiveness or salvation, something that didn't flinch at judgment. He believed in silence, he believed in survival, and he believed that no priest, no cross, no holy book could reach a boy who had already buried his soul. Not even God could thaw what had already turned to ice. He didn't shout, didn't crack jokes, didn't join the others smoking behind the gym or chasing girls down the block. Richard Kuklinski just watched, sat at the edge of things, tall, broad-shouldered even then, with eyes that didn't follow the crowd but measured it. Teachers called him polite. Neighbors said he was quiet, but there was something about the way he smiled that never reached his eyes. His calm made people uneasy, even if they couldn't say why. It was the kind of calm that didn't come from peace, it came from pressure, like a glass of still water hiding a stone at the bottom. He didn't fidget. He didn't complain. And that stillness felt less like serenity and more like something waiting. Kids would bump into him in the hallway, expect him to shove back, but he wouldn't. He'd just look at them. That stare, not angry, not amused, just blank, like he was studying you, like he was deciding if you were worth remembering. Some laughed behind his back, called him slow, called him soft, said he smiled weird. But Richard remembered every name, every face, and he waited. Because his calm wasn't surrender, it was storage. Everything they threw at him went into a box he never opened in public. But the box was filling. He started working jobs after school, lifting boxes, cleaning up loading docks. Didn't talk much, didn't ask for help, just did the work. One man said he never even saw the kids sweat. But once, someone shorted him on pay, told him to come back next week. Richard didn't argue, just nodded. Then came back that night and slashed every tire in the lot. Never got caught, never bragged, just showed up the next day like nothing happened. That was the pattern. People underestimated him, thought his silence meant softness. But it wasn't softness. It was silence sharpened into instinct. He never raised his voice, because he didn't need to. He didn't bluff, didn't posture. If Richard did something, it was because he meant it. And if he smiled, it wasn't because he was happy. It was because he already knew what was going to happen next. That was the thing people missed. His calm wasn't kindness. His stillness wasn't peace. His smile wasn't human. It was camouflage. And by the time you noticed the shadow behind it, you were already too close. It started with a job that wasn't supposed to be serious. Just a favor, a warning, a scare. That's what they told him. But Richard Kuklinski didn't believe in half measures. When he was sent to deliver a message, he delivered it with finality. The man was small time, owed money, ran his mouth, thought he could talk his way out of trouble. Met Richard in an alley behind a bar, somewhere between midnight and never. The man was still laughing when Richard pulled the blade. He didn't scream long. There was no noise when it ended, just the sound of blood tapping on concrete like slow rain. Richard stood over the body and felt nothing. No guilt, no fear. Only the quiet satisfaction of a job completed. He didn't run, didn't panic, just dragged the body behind the dumpster and wiped the handle clean. It was the first time he realized how easy it could be, easier than he'd expected, like snapping a twig no one would ever miss. And no one did. The man never came home. His apartment stayed dark. His name got mentioned at first whispers, some worried friends, a question here and there. But no police reports, no news stories, just silence. The kind of silence Richard had learned to trust. It was the same silence that filled his house as a boy. The same silence that grew around pain like a wall. Later, someone asked him if he'd seen the guy. Richard blinked, shrugged, and said, "Not in a while." That was the first lie. And just like the kill, it felt easy, natural, like stepping over a crack in the sidewalk without thinking. He thought he might feel something later. Regret, excitement, anything. But the only thing he felt was control. The knowledge that he could erase someone and walk away untouched. That he could lie with the same face he used to say, "Good morning." He told himself it wasn't murder. It was business. It wasn't personal. But even that was a lie. It was personal. Not because he hated the man, but because he liked the feeling. The silence afterward. The power. The clean break of it. The world didn't stop spinning. The sky didn't darken. Life moved on, as if that man had never existed. That was the lesson. That people vanish every day, and the world barely notices. That if you're quiet enough, calm enough, cold enough, you can take life and leave no ripple. And from that night on, Richard Kuklinski stopped thinking about lines, because he'd already stepped across one, and no one had noticed. He met her like most men meet someone they think might save them by accident, at the wrong time, in the right place. Her name was Barbara. She laughed easily, asked real questions, and didn't look at him like she saw something broken. She saw a man who was quiet, steady, maybe even a little shy. She saw safety. He let her. Richard Kuklinski had never been in love before. Not really. But Barbara made him feel like he could be, like he might belong to something gentle. He brought her flowers, opened doors, said things like "I love you" and "everything's okay" with a voice that even sounded warm when it needed to. It was the only time in his life that the lie felt like a gift, not a weapon. They got married, moved into a small place where the carpets were clean and the kitchen smelled like real dinners. They had kids, laughed over morning coffee, took family photos where Richard smiled, not wide, but just enough. It was believable. And in those years, he built a second life. To the neighbors, he was the quiet man who kept to himself. To the teachers at the school, he was the father who always showed up on time. To Barbara, he was a provider, a protector, the man who made sure the bills were paid, the fridge was full, and no one ever hurt their children the way he had once been hurt. But behind it all, the mask never slipped, not once. She never saw the way he clenched his jaw when things got too quiet, never asked why he disappeared for hours with no explanation, never looked in the trunk of the car. Love made her blind, or maybe it made her tired. Either way, she didn't ask, and Richard made sure she never needed to. There were moments, small ones, when he wondered if he could stay in that life. If pretending to be soft long enough might make it real. He'd watch Barbara fall asleep, the kids curled up on the couch, and for just a second, he'd feel something like peace. But peace was never going to stay, because the truth was always there, just beneath the surface. Every smile was a calculation. Every hug was rehearsed. He loved them, in the only way he could, but love didn't erase the cold. It only covered it. He wasn't a family man. He was death in a button-up shirt, and every day he kissed his wife goodbye, walked out the door, and stepped back into the shadows where softness had no place. By day, he sold images, smiling brides, toddlers in bow ties, glamour shots, and birthday banners. Richard Kuklinski ran a photo lab, just another man with chemicals on his fingers and a quiet look in his eye. Customers handed him memories in envelopes, never suspecting the man behind the counter knew how to make people disappear for real. But tucked behind the wedding portraits and graduation poses, there were other reels. Films not meant for daylight. 8mm stag flicks passed hand to hand in dim bars and back rooms. He didn't act in them, he moved them, duplicated, distributed, no names, just a price. He said yes to anything that paid well, and asked nothing. That's how he met them, not with fanfare, not with suits and rings and blood oaths. Just a man in a car, a quiet nod, and a request, a delivery. Then another. No questions, no smiles. Just envelopes full of film and cash, passed between hands that didn't want to know each other too well. The man in the car said he was with some people. Never said the word mafia, never had to. Richard knew. Everybody in Jersey knew. It was in the way he talked, the way he didn't talk, the way his driver never turned around. Eventually, the deliveries got heavier. A box that wasn't film, a favor that wasn't small, someone who needed reminding, then someone who needed removing. They liked Richard. He was calm, efficient. He didn't drink, didn't talk too much, and he didn't ask why. By night, he became someone else. Not the man who photographed school dances or held his daughter's hand crossing the street. At night, he drove back roads and alleyways with rope in the trunk and rage in his chest. At night, he made people vanish. The mafia didn't give him a title, didn't need to. He wasn't one of them, not really. He was a tool, a solution, a shadow that moved through city rot with precision. They paid him well to be silent, and Richard Kuklinski was very, very good at silence. Barbara never asked where the money came from. She liked the new furniture, the better car. The kids had clean clothes, the fridge never emptied, and Richard always came home in time for dinner. But outside that house, he was building something darker, a reputation without a name, a whisper that crept through the streets like a winter draft. They started calling him the Iceman. Not because of the way he looked, but because when he killed, it felt like the warmth got sucked out of the room, and the only thing left behind was the cold. He didn't knock on the door. He just kept showing up until someone opened it. That was how Roy DeMeo found him, not with a handshake, but with a nod. No introductions. Just a job, and then another, and another. That's how it worked in that world. You didn't get hired, you got used. Roy DeMeo wasn't just any street-level thug. He was a butcher in a suit, smiled like a salesman, killed like a surgeon, He ran with the Gambino crew, and his world was fast, brutal, and full of eyes that never blinked. He liked efficiency, liked silence, and Richard Kuklinski offered both. They met the way ghosts do in shadows. A quiet sit-down in the back of a car, words passed low and slow. No titles, no threats, just opportunity. Richard didn't ask how Roy knew about him. Men like DeMeo had ears everywhere. If you made people disappear well enough, someone eventually wanted to pay you for it. Roy gave him a test. A man, a name, a location, no details, just a time and a target. Richard didn't hesitate. The body was found 3 days later, frozen solid in a meat locker miles from where he'd been killed. Roy didn't ask why. He didn't need to. He just nodded, smiled thin, and said, "You're useful." That was it. No ceremony, no blood oath. Just the quiet acknowledgement that Richard Kuklinski had walked through the doorway into a world where trust meant death came on time, and silence meant loyalty. Roy opened more doors after that, introduced him to names most men only whispered: soldiers, captains, men who didn't blink when blood hit the wall. Richard didn't try to join. He wasn't built for the politics, the ego, the rituals. He wasn't Gambino. He was a freelancer, a phantom. But they knew his value. He became the invisible edge of their operation, the one who cleaned up what others left messy, the one who didn't brag, didn't drink, didn't slip. And DeMeo? He respected that. In another life, they might have been friends, but in this one, they were something colder. DeMeo was the key. Richard was the lock. Together, they opened doors that should have stayed shut. It was never about loyalty. It was about usefulness. And as long as Richard kept delivering bodies without questions, the door stayed open. But in that world, doors open two ways, and eventually, they close. He didn't invent the method, but he perfected it. Richard Kuklinski learned early that time tells stories. A bullet wound speaks, bruising whispers. A body left in the sun starts to talk too soon, but a frozen one? That's a corpse with nothing to say. They started calling him the Iceman because he froze the dead, locked them in industrial freezers, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. He'd kill a man on a Tuesday, then dump the body in an alley a month later. When police found it, the skin was pale, the rigor gone, and the timeline broken. It wasn't just about hiding the act. It was about scrambling the story. Medical examiners couldn't pinpoint a time of death. Witnesses who swore they saw the victim alive a week ago suddenly sounded credible. Alibis stood firm, even when the killer was staring them in the face. That was the science of confusion. The freezer stole clarity. It slowed decay, paused the natural order, turned blood to slush, and evidence to guesswork. Richard wasn't a doctor, but he understood meat. He'd worked slaughterhouses, cut beef, wrapped poultry. He knew what cold did to flesh and how hard it became to read once the warmth was gone. It wasn't just a trick. It was strategy, and it worked. Police chased ghosts, built timelines that bent in all the wrong places. Suspects came and went, leads froze just like the bodies, and Richard kept walking through his life like nothing had happened. Barbara didn't ask about the freezer, didn't ask why the garage had a second lock, or why Richard insisted on unloading certain deliveries himself. She didn't know what was behind that door, and maybe she didn't want to. Some silences were better left untouched. The mafia never questioned it either. They just saw results. Clean drops, no heat, no patterns. Just one less problem, and a man who never bragged. Later, when they asked him why he used freezers, he said it plain. To mess with their heads, he told the detective, to make it harder for them to figure things out. But maybe there was more to it. Maybe freezing the bodies gave him control over time, over truth. Maybe it wasn't just about confusing the cops. Maybe it was about owning the moment of death, long after it had passed, stretching it, replaying it, holding it, like a photograph locked in ice. The victim stopped breathing, but the story stayed paused. And that, to Richard Kuklinski, was power. Cold, absolute power. Some men kill in a fit of fury. Some shake when it's over. Some scream, cry, vomit, or pray. Richard Kuklinski did none of those things. When he killed, it wasn't rage. It wasn't personal. It was like flipping a switch, tightening a bolt, turning off a light. Just function. He'd once been ruled by anger. As a boy, it had burned inside him like a furnace with no release. But the older he got, the colder that fire became. Rage turned into focus. And when it came time to take a life, that focus made him untouchable. He didn't yell, didn't swear, didn't even speed up his breathing. To the people who watched him work, those rare few who lived long enough to notice, it was almost eerie. He didn't fumble, didn't hesitate. He was efficient, mechanical. He could strangle a man with piano wire, then stop for coffee on the way home. The job never followed him. It ended the second the body hit the ground, because to Richard, it was a job, not a moment of madness, not a personal vendetta, just a task, start to finish. He never wanted to know their names, didn't care what they'd done. He wasn't judge or jury. He was the final punctuation. Sometimes he used guns, other times knives. Sometimes he poisoned them. Cyanide in a burger, a mist in the face. They'd cough once, stumble, then drop. That was his favorite. Clean, quiet, clinical. He could kill in seconds and walk away without a blink. And in that stillness was the real horror. Because Richard Kuklinski didn't need to hate you to end you. Didn't need to be provoked. If your name was on the list, that was enough. You were already dead. You just didn't know it yet. No fury, no shaking hands, just ice in his veins and math in his mind. Barbara never saw it. The kids never guessed. He could hold his daughter's hand after burying a man in a ditch an hour before. Could tell a bedtime story, then step out into the dark and end someone's. He called it compartmentalizing. The therapists, years later, called it something else. But by then, it didn't matter, because the truth had always been simple. Richard didn't kill because he was angry. He killed because he was asked to. And when he did, he felt nothing. No joy, no guilt. Just the cold, quiet rhythm of a man doing what he was made to do. There were mornings when Richard Kuklinski packed school lunches before he packed a gun. He'd wave goodbye at the front door, kiss his wife, and watch the kids head off with backpacks too big for their shoulders. Then he'd step into his car, drive to a quiet place, and become something else entirely. He was both. The man who stood politely at PTA meetings, listening as teachers talked about spelling bees and science fairs, and the man who tucked a silencer into his coat pocket just hours before. One hand held his son's report card, the other held death. Neighbors described him as respectful, a little distant, maybe, but polite. He shoveled his driveway in winter, helped carry groceries, asked how your mother was doing, never caused a scene, but behind the calm was calculation. Richard understood how to blend. He knew the safest place to hide a monster was behind a smile. So he smiled. He nodded. He showed up. He learned the names of the teachers. He remembered birthdays. He looked like the kind of man who paid his taxes early. All the while, he was erasing people from the earth. There were afternoons when he changed clothes in the garage before coming inside, washed blood from his hands before hugging his kids. He could go from firing a gun with a suppressor in an alley to helping with homework in under an hour, because the two lives were never separate. They overlapped like shadows. He once sat through an entire school recital with duct tape under his coat and a knife in his boot, smiled for the camera, clapped at the right moments. No one knew the man beside them had ended a life before lunch. Barbara didn't see it, or maybe she did, just didn't want to believe it. The money came in, the bills got paid, he was present. That was more than she could say for a lot of husbands. He was a father who loved deeply, and a killer who felt nothing. That was the trick. He compartmentalized so cleanly, even his reflection might not recognize itself from day to day. One moment, a man building a dollhouse. The next, wiping down a silencer. The kids remember him laughing. The victims never heard him speak. Because when Richard Kuklinski became the Iceman, it didn't require a costume, just a change in tone, a shift in breath, and a decision to be death in the form of a husband, a father, a ghost in clean clothes, the family man reaper. He treated it like shopping. Lists, timing, location, execution. No drama, no delays. You needed bread, milk, and someone gone? Richard Kuklinski could do all three before dinner. His delivery routes weren't mapped by roads, they were marked by names. Names whispered over phones, slid across diner tables, passed hand to hand in coded nods. It started with one job, then two, then more. Soon, the man who once moved porn reels and wedding prints was running routes that ended with silence. One stop for groceries, one stop for a silencer, one stop to end a life and be home before the roast cooled. Sometimes he stacked the jobs, Newark first. A man who owed someone too much, a small cough, a cloud of cyanide, and the man crumpled in the alley like laundry. Then onto the next town, pick up milk, eggs, shoot a man in the back of the head in the parking lot. Richard timed it down to the minute, not out of pride, just precision. He believed in efficiency the way others believed in luck. He'd keep receipts from the store in the glove compartment, tangible proof that he was somewhere else, doing something mundane. It wasn't just about the kill. It was about the cover. He played both sides of the line like a man walking a tightrope in the fog. He didn't boast, didn't write names in a book. He remembered everything: faces, streets, the way people looked at him a few seconds before they realized it was over. If the job asked for a message, he delivered it. If it required silence, he offered only the thud of inevitability. No scene, no signature, just clean exits. He never used the same method twice in a row. Cyanide, strangulation, gunshot, pipe, rope, knife, blunt trauma. Every kill had its own rhythm, like tracks on a record, and he played them without missing a beat. To Richard, death was logistics. He learned which neighborhoods had cameras, which buildings had dogs, which back alleys swallowed sounds. He scouted for shadows, memorized traffic lights, kept extra plates for the car in the trunk. He was a one-man operation, no crew, no lookouts, no loose ends. Barbara thought he was just running errands, picking up this, dropping off that. And he was, just not in the way she imagined, because the real delivery wasn't what he brought home, it was what he left behind. A corpse in a stairwell, a bloodstain under neon lights, a life snatched away in the quiet space between routine stops. To Richard Kuklinski, a contract was just another item on the list, and death, just something else to check off before dinner. He didn't have a favorite. That's what made him different. Some men stuck to what they knew. One gun, one knife, one tired signature. Richard Kuklinski didn't believe in habits. He believed in options. Like tools in a box, like colors on a palette. The job decided the method, not his mood. Poison was elegant. A quiet breath of cyanide mist in a victim's face. No sound, no mess. Just a stumble, a cough, a final confusion. Perfect for crowded places, restaurants, sidewalks, elevator lobbies. The body dropped, and Richard kept walking. Just another passerby, just another businessman with somewhere to be. But sometimes poison wasn't enough. Sometimes the job needed noise. A pistol offered certainty. One clean shot behind the ear, or two to the chest, one to the head. He knew what kind of ammunition tore through bone without making too much of a scene. He knew how to tape the handle, how to wipe it down, how to toss it into the river without leaving a ripple in his life. Still, there were moments when the old methods were better. Pipe wrench, crowbar, hammer, heavy tools that didn't require precision, just commitment. Those weren't about efficiency. They were about message, about fear, about leaving something behind that would echo long after the body was zipped up. When they needed it, brutal. When the kill was meant to send a signal, Richard delivered it with muscle and metal. He once beat a man to death in a parking garage with a tire iron, then used the same hand to buy ice cream for his daughter an hour later. Didn't flinch, didn't blink. Because to him, the kill wasn't the climax, it was the conclusion, the punctuation at the end of a sentence someone else had written. He could strangle a man with wire, smother with a pillow, snap a neck with his bare hands. He knew how long it took a man to die, knew what death looked like at every stage, and more importantly, he knew how to make it look like something else. Car accident, heart attack, suicide. He'd studied the body the way artists study form. Anatomy wasn't mystery, it was mathematics. And Richard Kuklinski was fluent in the numbers of death. But it wasn't cruelty that guided him. It was function, poison when silence mattered, pistol when speed did, pipe wrench when memory was the goal. He didn't enjoy the act. He respected it. Every ending had a purpose. Every method had a meaning. And Richard? He was fluent in all of them. Even the coldest men carry rules. Richard Kuklinski had his, etched not in stone, but in silence. They weren't written down. They weren't discussed, but they were followed. Every time. No women, no kids, ever. He didn't explain it, didn't need to. For all the blood he spilled, all the lives he ended, there were lines even he wouldn't cross. And when someone tried to test that boundary, they found out fast that he didn't bend. There was a job once, quiet street, clean target, easy money. But the man showed up with his daughter, maybe 6 years old, skipping beside him with a balloon. Richard lowered the gun and walked away. Didn't finish the job, didn't take the money. The man lived for a little while, not because he deserved it, but because the rules mattered more. Another time, a hit came with extras. The contract named the husband, but the wife, the note said, might accidentally witness it. Richard returned the envelope unopened, told them to find someone else. And they did. But the one they sent didn't make it home. Because Richard had his code, he could snap your neck in a hallway and sit down to dinner 20 minutes later. But if there was a child in the room, he became a statue. Cold, quiet, unmoving. He didn't believe in innocence, not really. Not after the life he'd lived. But he believed in boundaries. Even monsters need fences. The rules weren't about morality. They were about control, about keeping the animal in its cage. If he started breaking those lines, he knew there'd be nothing left of him worth recognizing. And somewhere deep down, past the ice and the silence, that still mattered. Barbara never knew the details, but she knew there were things he wouldn't do. He was strict with the kids, stern, quiet, disciplined, but never cruel. Never what his own father had been. That line, too, stayed sharp in his mind. He carried pain, but he didn't pass it down. He once said he'd rather kill 10 men than let one child cry because of him. And people laughed, thought it was dark humor. But he meant it, fully, dead serious. Because Richard Kuklinski wasn't a good man. But he wasn't every kind of bad. He chose his targets. He chose his limits. And when the job demanded something outside that narrow path, he walked away, or made them disappear instead. No women, no kids, just rules. In the end, that's what kept the last part of him human, or close enough. There was nothing special about the bag in his trunk. A wrench, some duct tape, a pair of gloves, a screwdriver, pliers, rope, a roll of black electrical tape, and a hammer worn smooth from use. It could have belonged to any handyman, any mechanic, any father fixing a shelf or patching a pipe. But in Richard Kuklinski's hands, it wasn't a toolbox. It was a promise, a quiet kind of death kit, carried between grocery trips and gas stops. He liked ordinary things, because ordinary didn't raise eyebrows. It slipped under radar, melted into the background, stayed unremembered. A man in overalls with a wrench is a worker. A man with duct tape in his glove compartment is just a guy fixing something. He wore beige windbreakers, scuffed shoes, and plain baseball caps. No watches, no jewelry, nothing to snag on memory. Richard understood that disguise wasn't a costume. It was a context. One job, he dressed like a delivery man, brown shirt, clipboard, cap, tilted low, rang the bell, smiled, got the signature, then stepped inside and finished the task. Another time, he wore a full suit, clean shave, sunglasses, a clipboard under one arm. No one questioned a man who looked like he belonged to a company. No one looked twice. He used duct tape not just to bind hands, but to seal mouths, cover eyes, wrap tools, and silence doors. It was the sound he liked most, the smooth rip, the snug stick. Final, simple, predictable. Like him, sometimes the tape was used for makeshift gags, other times to muffle metal. He once wrapped the butt of a pistol in it to muffle the click against a belt buckle. It wasn't art, it was function. He didn't need elaborate gadgets, just things that worked, things no one would notice until it was far too late. He carried costume changes in his trunk, spare hats, jackets, even glasses. He could leave a scene and re-enter it minutes later, looking like a different man entirely. The trick wasn't to disappear. The trick was to never be noticed in the first place. And it worked. There are photos of him from that era leaning against a car, sipping coffee, blending in with the rest of the street. But behind that plastic cup might have been a vial of cyanide. In the same coat pocket, a wire garrote. The same hands that held his child's car seat had, earlier that week, held a man's throat. To Richard Kuklinski, disguise wasn't deception, it was design. And duct tape? That was just another signature, only quieter. There was no ledger, no wall with marks, no trophies on a shelf. Just absence, just silence, just a long trail of vanishing names and a man who never looked back. Richard Kuklinski didn't count his kills not because he couldn't, but because it didn't matter. A number was for bragging. He wasn't interested in pride. He was interested in erasure. Some say it was 100. Others say 200. One detective swore it was over 300. Journalists wrote headlines with bold guesses, and investigators whispered theories over cold coffee in dim rooms. But Richard never corrected them, never confirmed, never denied. He just listened, maybe smirked, because the truth wasn't in the number. It was in the weight behind his silence. He could name them if he wanted to. Not all, maybe. But enough. The ones that fought, the ones that begged, the ones that didn't see it coming at all. He remembered the alley behind the diner, the motel off the highway, the elevator with the slow door, the river that swallowed more than fish. They weren't statistics to him. They were solved problems, crossed out jobs, pages already turned. He once said killing became like breathing, not urgent, not emotional, just necessary. But still, there were nights. He stood by the window and stared out, cigarette in hand, no words, no motion, just stillness. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't counting bodies, but replaying them, like footsteps, echoing in reverse. Not guilt, not regret, just memory. A quiet, private archive of every time someone vanished, and no one asked the right questions. The FBI tried to pin it down. They brought in charts, photos, maps, lists. They asked him over and over, "How many? Which ones? Can you confirm?" And he would smile a little, tilt his head, say something vague. Sometimes he gave a name they hadn't even found yet. Sometimes he gave none. He kept the mystery thick, like fog on cold pavement, not to protect himself. That part was already done. But because control was the last power he had, they couldn't cage the full truth if they didn't know its shape. And Richard made sure they never would. Maybe it was 100, maybe 200, maybe fewer, maybe more. But the exact number didn't matter. What mattered was this. When Richard Kuklinski walked into a room, death followed at a distance, counting quietly behind him. They never called him a made man. He wasn't Italian, didn't grow up kissing pinky rings or learning Sicilian blessings whispered over pasta. But the 5 families still opened their doors to him quietly, cautiously, like feeding a lion through the bars. Richard Kuklinski wasn't part of their world, but he was useful to it. Extremely useful. He got contracts through Roy, then through others. Word traveled fast. Here was a man who didn't ask questions, who didn't flinch, who didn't need backup or excuses or cleanup crews. You gave him a name. He gave you silence. He did work for the Gambinos, the Genovese, the De Cavalcantes, even some whispers of Lucchese ties. They all used him, like a ghost they didn't have to feed. He wasn't part of the hierarchy. He didn't sit at tables. He didn't wear the suit and chain. But he was there, in the shadows behind the real soldiers. He was the blade they hired when they didn't want blood on their own hands. No one ever saw the job get done. They just saw the absence that followed. He liked it that way. Sometimes a consigliere would pass a name through 3 middlemen before it got to him. Sometimes it was a piece of paper slipped under a windshield wiper. Sometimes it was nothing more than a nod from across a deli. The language of the underworld didn't need words, just results. Richard never boasted, never flashed his earnings. He took the money and kept moving. But he knew who he was dealing with, and he knew the stakes. One wrong look, one wrong rumor, and the very families that used him would erase him. That's how it worked. That's how it always worked. But they didn't, because he was too valuable and too feared. Even mobsters get scared. In the end, when the feds closed in, the names vanished. All those mafia friends became ghosts. Not one lawyer showed up. Not one favor got called in. Richard stood alone, like he always had, because ghosts don't testify, and devils don't have friends, just deals, just silence. He wasn't their blood, he was their shadow, and that's all they ever needed him to be. The trick was temperature, not bullets, not blades, not poison, time, slowed and twisted. Richard Kuklinski learned early that a dead body tells a story, but a frozen one lies. When he first slid a body into a deep freezer, it wasn't out of panic, it was calculation. He wanted to buy time, stop decay, break the rhythm of rot. What he found instead was a loophole, a way to confuse forensics, mislead coroners, and shatter the chain of cause and effect. Keep a man on ice for a week, then drop him in an alley. His insides are frozen, his skin is warm. The cops write down the wrong time of death, which means alibis break apart. Suspects walk free, or innocent men fall. It was the perfect crime's perfect accessory. Cold, silent, obedient. He used it more than once. One body was held for months, then dumped like it had just been killed that morning. Another sat sealed inside a metal drum, wrapped in plastic, stacked behind frozen sides of beef. His kids walked past it without ever knowing, and when the body finally thawed and surfaced, the science didn't match. It pointed nowhere. That was the plan. Richard didn't brag about it. He just called it smart. To him, murder wasn't about rage. It was about management. He didn't need to enjoy it. He needed to control it, and the freezer trick gave him that control. Over timelines, over investigators, over fate itself. It earned him the nickname too, the Iceman, fitting, because he was always more chill than hot. He didn't shout, didn't wave guns or beat his chest. He just disappeared men, quietly, systematically, efficiently, like turning off a switch and placing the bulb in a freezer drawer. Later, when the interviews came, he mentioned it like a passing thought. "Oh yeah, I froze him," he said, like he was talking about leftovers. And even then, when they tried to map his kills, pin him to scenes, lock down his steps, they couldn't, because the clock had been broken. The story had been frozen mid-sentence, and every timeline they tried to draw melted in their hands. He didn't just kill people, he killed certainty, with nothing but a chest freezer and a quiet grin. He packed school lunches with one hand and wiped blood from a car seat with the other. He cheered at talent shows and fixed loose hinges on bedroom doors. He kissed foreheads goodnight, then stepped into the dark to do things his family would never believe. To his children, Richard Kuklinski wasn't a hitman. He was a teddy bear. They knew him as the quiet one, the man who brought home candy and toys and hugged like he meant it. He was the dad who sat through cartoons, who let them crawl into his lap, who told them they were safe. And he believed it when he said it. In his own twisted way, he was keeping the world away from them, fighting monsters by becoming one. He never raised a hand to them. That was his line. He swore he would never be like his father, and he wasn't. His kids never saw the switchblade in the glove box or the rope in the trunk. They never saw the look in his eye when someone crossed him outside their home. But sometimes, the mask slipped, like when the dog barked too much and he went too still, or when a neighbor raised his voice and Richard's silence filled the hallway like smoke. His wife felt it. The kids didn't know how to name it, but they felt it too. A tension, coiled just beneath the flannel shirts and fatherly nods. Still, they believed the myth. To them, he was a man who worked hard and loved harder, who fixed what was broken and stood tall when things went wrong. He was their center of gravity. A little gruff, a little mysterious, but never frightening. Until one day, he vanished in handcuffs, and the news told a different story. His daughter would later say she never knew, that she thought her dad was the gentlest man alive. Maybe he was, to her. That's the riddle of Richard Kuklinski, the man who could strangle a stranger with piano wire, then come home with bubblegum for his youngest. Not all monsters roar. Some wear slippers. Some tuck you in and hum softly as you fall asleep. He wasn't just a killer. He was a father trying to outrun his own past, one bedtime story at a time. Barbara loved him. That much was real. The dinners, the dances, the stolen smiles across a crowded room, but they weren't fake. But love, even deep love, has shadows. And Barbara lived inside one for years. She knew he had a temper. She knew his silences could stretch across days. She knew not to ask too many questions when he came home late, or when he left in the middle of the night, locking the door behind him without a word. But that's not the same as knowing the truth. She knew he worked in film distribution. That's what he told her. Pornography reels, sometimes photography. He paid the bills, paid them well, too well, maybe. But life had been hard before him, harder without him. So she told herself not to look too closely. There were warning signs. Of course there were. The time she found a small pistol in a kitchen drawer. The time a man in a leather jacket came to the door, said nothing, just stared at Richard, then left. The time she touched his hand and found it cold, not from the weather, but from something else, something inside. She asked once, early on, what he really did. He smiled, said, "Better you don't know." And then he kissed her on the cheek, like it was just any other evening. Barbara wasn't stupid. She just wanted to believe. She wanted the man who made pancakes on Sundays, not the man whose stare could freeze fire. But deep down, something whispered to her. A tiny voice she buried beneath chores and school drop-offs and church pews. He never hurt her. Not like his own father had hurt his mother. That mattered. But there were nights when he stared at the television without blinking, and she felt the air thicken. There were mornings when his clothes smelled of bleach, and he claimed he spilled something at work. And there were the sudden bursts of anger, short, sharp, gone in seconds, but deep enough to leave her rattled. She didn't have a word for what he was. Not then. Only later, much later, when the police came, when the courtroom filled with the names of the dead, when reporters called him the Iceman, did the pieces fall together. But even then, even with the truth splashed across headlines, part of her still clung to the man who made her laugh, the man who loved their kids, the man who held her hand in the dark. She knew something, but never everything, and maybe that was the only way she could survive him. He checked the door twice, then a third time, then once more, just to be sure. The deadbolt slid home with a dull clunk, and he stood there in the hallway, listening not to the outside world, but to the storm rising quietly in his own head. Paranoia has no sirens, only echoes. The more Richard Kuklinski killed, the more he feared someone would return the favor. He had learned to be invisible. That was the point. Kill clean, kill cold, leave no questions behind. But no matter how perfect the job, how silent the ending, something always clung to him after. Not guilt, never guilt, but caution, a weight in the chest, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, someone had seen something. So he checked windows, looked under cars, studied faces in the supermarket for too long. He knew which neighbors left their lights on all night, and which ones had new curtains. He memorized plate numbers on cars that parked too long near his street. He took different routes home from the same places. Sometimes he switched up his routines just because the air felt off. And at home, in the space where he was supposed to be, Dad, he still couldn't relax, not fully. He would sit at the dinner table with his children talking about school projects and cartoons, while his mind wandered to whether he'd cleaned all the fingerprints from the trunk latch. He would hug his wife goodnight, then stare at the ceiling for hours, waiting for a knock that never came. Silence became suspicious. Peace felt like bait. Even in sleep, the locks weren't enough. He sometimes woke gasping from dreams with no plot, just flickers of faces. Some were real. Others, he'd long forgotten, or tried to. He once ripped the phone from the wall because it rang too long. He once followed a man for half a mile, convinced he was being tailed, only to find he was just a jogger. He told himself it was smart to be careful, that it wasn't fear, it was survival. But fear doesn't care what you name it. It just grows. With every life he took, a new shadow seemed to sprout behind him. No matter how cleanly he moved, he imagined the click of a camera, the shuffle of shoes too close behind, the stare of a cop who knew but hadn't acted yet. Richard had perfected the art of killing, but the price of that perfection was never peace. Only locks, and more locks, and the haunting suspicion that someone, somewhere, was waiting to make him answer for everything. Richard didn't talk. Not to friends, not to neighbors, not even to the men who handed him cash in dim parking lots or crowded diners. That was part of the deal. You want him? Fine. But don't ask how he'll do it. Don't ask when. And when it's done, don't speak his name again. It wasn't bravado. It was design. Some men in the life couldn't help themselves. They drank too much, told stories too loud, laughed too hard at the wrong jokes. They needed to feel big. Richard didn't. He didn't want to be remembered. He wanted to disappear between jobs. Quiet car, quiet clothes, quiet exits. His phone calls were short. His meetings were shorter. He picked up envelopes with no small talk, delivered results with no eye contact. And when the job was done, he didn't wait for applause. He just went home. Maybe kissed his wife. Maybe watched cartoons with his kids. Maybe sat in the dark, checking the locks again. No one ever saw him celebrate. There were no calling cards, no flashy coats or gold rings, no signature to leave behind. Just absence, a life removed. That was the art. That was the craft. The fewer moving parts, the fewer things to break. He didn't want partners, didn't want lookouts. Witnesses were liabilities, so were friends. He studied people, not for connection, but for routine. When they left, what doors they used, what time they stopped for lunch. He could map a stranger's day with eerie precision, then fold into it like a shadow. Wait, act, leave. That was the formula. Even the tools stayed simple. Tape, wire, hammer, antifreeze, sometimes. If a body had to vanish, he knew where the ground was soft, or where the river ran too deep for questions. But most of the time, it wasn't about creativity. It was about not making mistakes. Richard didn't kill because he was loud inside. He killed because it made sense, because the silence afterward was his reward. The clean end, the still air. He liked that part. Later, when they asked how many, he only shrugged. Sometimes he gave a number, Sometimes he didn't. But even then, even in the interviews behind thick glass and steel bars, he never gave it all away. There were things he took with him, and things he buried where only the cold remembered. It wasn't about ego, it was about business. And business, for Richard, was always best handled in silence. The snow fell quietly that night, the kind of snowfall that softened the world, made everything seem clean. White rooftops, glowing windows, kids on sleds earlier in the day, now tucked in warm beds. And Richard Kuklinski, driving home, blood on his sleeve, a gift bag on the passenger seat, and cocoa mix in the trunk. He had just ended a man's life. Quick, efficient, no drama. The job had gone smooth, clean shot, quick disposal, no bystanders, no noise. And now he was thinking about whether the tree lights would still be on when he got home. Whether his daughter had remembered to put the angel on top like she always insisted. To Richard, there was no contradiction in any of this. He walked in the door with a smile, hung his coat, kicked off his boots like any other father returning from work. The warmth of the house hit him like a second skin, the smell of cinnamon, the faint sound of a Christmas cartoon from the living room. His youngest still awake, curled up in pajamas, waiting. He poured the cocoa, extra marshmallows, just like she liked it. No one would guess what his hands had just done. No one would see the man in the car trunk or the silence left behind in a warehouse 3 miles away. All they saw was Dad, still in time for bedtime stories. There was something ritualistic about it. The killings had a routine, but so did the holidays. The lights on the porch, the taped-up paper snowflakes, the way Richard made sure every gift was wrapped just right. His children never missed a Christmas, never saw a fight, never even heard him raise his voice. He could shut it all off like a switch. The rage, the violence, the cold calculation. It stayed outside. Inside was his bubble. Warmth, laughter, cocoa. And yet, beneath it, something always pulsed, like a second rhythm just below the surface. He'd sit beside the tree, his child in his lap, and part of him would be scanning shadows, listening for the wrong kind of car to stop outside, wondering if tonight was the night his two worlds would finally crash into each other. But they never did. Year after year, he kept them separate, the blood and the lights, the kill and the cocoa. And no one, not even the people closest to him, ever truly saw both at the same time. It was the perfect illusion, and maybe, on some strange level, it was also his gift to them. He always said it didn't thrill him. There was no pleasure in it, no rush, no joy, no twisted sense of control. It was business, cold, functional, a service rendered, and a fee collected. That's how Richard Kuklinski explained it, again and again. And he said it with such calm that you almost believed him. He wasn't the kind of man who laughed after a job. He didn't go out for drinks. He didn't keep trophies or newspaper clippings. He didn't even remember some of the names. It wasn't about who the person was. It was about what was owed, a debt, a betrayal, a quiet order passed down the line. Richard was just the instrument. He wasn't sloppy, and he didn't enjoy it. At least, that's what he said. The money helped him keep the mask on. Groceries without worry, vacations with his wife, private school tuition, toys at Christmas, a nice car, a modest house in a quiet neighborhood where no one knew what he was. He always made sure the money came clean. No flashy spending, no gold watches or loud suits, just checks for the mortgage, gifts for the kids, trips to the boardwalk. He wanted to look like any other dad on the block, and for the most part, he did. When people asked what he did for work, he said he was in sales, or transportation, or film distribution, and that was technically true. In the same way a guillotine is technically a blade, but still, there were moments when the silence stretched too long after a job, when he sat in his car afterward, hands on the wheel, and didn't start the engine right away, when he watched the breath rise from his mouth in winter and stared into nothing. That's when you wondered, Did he really feel nothing? Or did he just train himself to pretend? He said he never did it for pleasure, only for pay. That was his rule, his line, his excuse. But a man doesn't kill that many people unless something inside him knows how to justify it. And maybe, somewhere deep beneath all that calm, there was something darker than even he wanted to face. But he never blinked when he said it. Never wavered. Never admitted a flicker of enjoyment. Only business. Only payment. Never for pleasure. He swore that was true. No shouting. No drama. No witnesses. That was the point. Richard Kuklinski didn't just know how to take a life. He knew how to erase it. Entirely. Like it never happened. And when someone vanished without a trace, no one asked questions. At least not for long. He learned early that pulling the trigger was only step one. The real challenge came afterward. What to do with the weight of what remained. The blood, the smell, the mess, the risk of being found. So he got creative. Quietly, methodically. Sometimes, it was as simple as a barrel, a steel drum. Fill it with lime or cement, seal the lid tight, and roll it into a landfill that stretched miles wide. Once it sank into that sea of waste, it became just another forgotten thing. Other times, it meant going industrial. A furnace in a bakery after hours, a meat grinder in a closed butcher's shop. He wasn't squeamish, and he didn't look away. It wasn't about horror, it was about control. There were no ghosts when there were no remains. He once used a cave, deep in the woods, cold, damp, and crawling with time. The kind of place no one stumbles into by accident. He called it his graveyard, a place where the echoes went to die. He studied chemicals, not for science but for silence. Acids that dissolved flesh, solvents that stripped away fingerprints. He knew how long it took for bone to turn brittle, how to bleach a skull until it looked like it came from a medical drawer. He used rats, too. Left the bodies in places where vermin would finish what he started. By the time anyone might have found it, nature had taken the blame. Sometimes he waited months before word came back that no one had seen the guy, and he'd just nod, like he was surprised. He never left a trail, not if he could help it. No fibers, no blood, no shell casings, just a vanishing, like smoke in the cold. People thought he had supernatural luck, or some divine shield. But it wasn't magic. It was patience, cold planning, and a complete lack of hesitation. He made bodies vanish because fear wasn't enough. Fear fades, but absence, that lingers. No funeral, no goodbye, no trace, just silence. That was the real power. Not killing, erasing. The other parents waved at their kids, smiled, sipped coffee from paper cups as car doors swung open and backpacks bounced. Richard Kuklinski just sat there, hands on the wheel, eyes scanning the rearview mirror. Not for his kids, but for shadows that didn't belong. He'd been careful, always careful. No loose ends, no names, no attachments. But something had shifted. He couldn't name it, couldn't point to one moment. It was just a feeling, like cold breath on the back of his neck. It started small, the same car parked 2 blocks down on more than one morning. A man at the gas station who glanced a second too long. A phone call that clicked once before going dead. Nothing you could prove, but everything you could feel. He stopped sleeping deep, started checking the locks more than once, staring out the blinds at 3 in the morning. The shadows didn't move, but his mind did. Fast, hard, like it had to stay 2 steps ahead or be swallowed. Even in the school pickup line, surrounded by moms in yoga pants and minivans plastered with honor roll stickers, he felt exposed, vulnerable, and that was a word he hated. He kept one hand near his lap where the small pistol rested beneath a folded jacket, just in case. His daughter would open the door, cheerful and unaware, rambling about a field trip or a class pet. And he would nod, smile the right amount, say the right things. But inside, he was listening to footsteps, to engines starting up behind him, to a cough from the wrong direction. He'd built a life where fear didn't belong, where power kept it out. But now fear was in the car with him, silent, watching the mirrors too, Barbara noticed. Not directly, but in the way he snapped when the phone rang, the way he paced in the hallway at night, the way he double-checked her grocery lists and quizzed her on who she spoke to at the store. She asked if everything was okay. He said yes. She didn't believe him, but she didn't press. There was a time when Richard Kuklinski could kill without blinking, and then make spaghetti for dinner. But now, he blinked. Now, he paused at yellow lights. Now he stared a little too long at the man jogging past his mailbox. The cracks weren't wide. Not yet, but they were spreading. In the school pickup line, engines idled, children ran, and Richard watched the mirror not for traffic, not for kids, for anything, for everything. Because when you've erased enough people, you start to wonder who's trying to erase you. Paul Hoffman thought he was meeting a businessman. A deal had been arranged. A handshake over rare pornographic films Kuklinski claimed to have access to. In Paul's world, that kind of thing sold quietly, discreetly, and lucratively. He had brought cash thousands in small bills, and the naive belief that men like Richard were just hustlers, not monsters. It was supposed to be a simple transaction, the kind of backroom deal where no one gets hurt, just embarrassed if it goes public. Paul parked in a small lot in North Bergen, clutching his briefcase like it might grow legs and escape. He looked nervous, but not scared. Not yet. Kuklinski arrived late. Not sloppy late, intentionally late. Enough to make Paul wait, sweat a little, wonder. When Richard finally appeared, his face was calm, unreadable. He apologized smoothly, like a real salesman, and led Paul into a building he claimed was a warehouse. No cameras, no clerks, just locked doors and promises. Inside, the temperature dropped, not because of air conditioning, but because of who Richard became once that door closed behind them. Paul sensed it. Too late. That shift. That stillness. He asked where the tapes were. Richard asked where the money was. Paul opened the case. Clean bills, tidy rows, trust in paper form. Then came the silence. There were no tapes. There was no deal. There was just Richard Kuklinski. And a tire iron. He struck Paul once, then again. No raised voice, no rush, just impact, precision. Paul collapsed like a marionette whose strings were cut. But it didn't end there. Richard took his time. Not out of rage, there was none. Only function, efficiency, detachment dressed as control. When it was done, the money was tucked away, and the body, broken, limp, soaked, was wrapped and stuffed inside a steel drum. Not dumped immediately. That would have been careless. The drum sat for a while. Kuklinski wanted to test things. Timelines, temperature, how long flesh stayed frozen, how evidence could be buried in routine. Paul Hoffman vanished. His car was found, abandoned. His name appeared on flyers, then in police files, then in rumors. But not in the morgue. Not for years. For Richard, this was not a murder. It was a message. About trust. About debt. About weakness. About believing that normal rules applied to abnormal men. He didn't talk about Paul often, but when he did, it was with the same cold shrug he might use to describe a weather report. Years later, when the confessions started, this story came up, but even then, details shifted, time bent. Richard had buried so many truths under layers of ice and lies that even he didn't always seem sure which version he liked best. What never changed was the lesson. If you owed Kuklinski money, and the deal went quiet, so did you. Forever. He started experimenting. Not out of necessity, but curiosity. That was always the part people got wrong about Richard Kuklinski. He wasn't just a hired gun. He was a student of silence, an engineer of endings. And when the usual ways began to bore him, he got creative. Not loud, not wild, just strange. By then, he had already killed more men than most hitmen dreamed of. Blunt force, gunshots, garrotes, those were routine. But routine didn't teach him anything new, and the one thing he hated more than being caught was being predictable. So he tested, not just on people. First on dogs, strays, quiet creatures. He wanted to know how fast something could die without a mark. Cyanide fascinated him. Not the tablets from spy movies, he made his own versions. He'd crush the compound into powder, dissolve it into solutions, evaporate it into a fine mist, a soft exhale of death. In one case, he fed a dog a piece of hamburger soaked in his mix. The animal wagged its tail once, then dropped. No sound, just collapse. Richard knelt beside the body and watched the eyes glaze over. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. He just filed the moment away like a researcher. Then came people. He carried the mist in a nasal spray bottle. That way, it looked like hay fever. A quick squeeze under the victim's nose. The person would stagger, gasp, clutch at the air, and then fall. The method worked beautifully in crowds. No loud bang, no panic. Just one more man lying down in the street. Maybe a heart attack, maybe heat stroke. Richard walked away while others screamed. But with the experiments came something else. Not mistakes, exactly, but shadows. He started hearing things in the freezer room. That old industrial space he used to store some of the bodies just for a while, just to confuse the timeline, began to hum differently. Once, he swore he heard whispering. Not loud, just under the compressor, like voices trapped inside the ice, calling his name, not accusing, just remembering. He didn't like that, so he tested the mist on himself, just a drop, just to know how much was too much. His vision blurred for hours. He didn't tell Barbara. He just sat in the garage, staring at the concrete, fingers twitching every now and then, trying to feel normal again. But normal was long gone, and the messes started stacking up. A body that didn't freeze right, a timeline that didn't match the autopsy, a police report that raised quiet questions. Richard, the man who once moved like a ghost, had started to leave footprints, small ones, but enough. Still, he couldn't stop pushing the edge. The thrill wasn't in the kill, it was in the method. Could it be cleaner, quieter, smarter? Could a man vanish without even a bruise? The cyanide gave him answers, but the whispers in the freezer kept asking questions. It didn't happen all at once. That's the thing about the cold shoulder in his world, it moves slow, like winter creeping in through the cracks. First, it was silence from the men who used to check in weekly. Then it was jobs getting passed over, deals whispered about but never offered. Richard Kuklinski noticed. He noticed everything. The men in the suits stopped shaking his hand the same way. Not rude, just different. Eyes didn't meet his like before. Words got clipped. That fake warmth that floated through cigar smoke and greasy diner booths, it thinned out, faded. He'd show up to places where the old crew used to gather, and suddenly someone was already walking out. Wrong time, wrong night. Some of it might have been coincidence, but not all of it. He knew how shadows moved. He was one. It started after Roy DeMeo, the one who brought him in. Roy had been the doorway to everything, the contracts, the families, the invisible nods that said this man is safe. But when Roy disappeared, that doorway slammed shut. No one explained. No one had to. In that world, explanations were dangerous. Silence was the message. Still, Richard kept his cool. He didn't chase anyone, didn't beg. That wasn't his way. But he felt it. The distance, the frost, and it made something curl inside him. Something heavy. He remembered sitting in his car one night, parked outside a spot where he used to do business. He watched the front door, saw men come and go. They didn't see him, or maybe they did and pretended not to. The coldness wasn't just outside the windshield, it was inside him now. Settling in his ribs, he lit a cigarette. He didn't even smoke much, but the ritual helped. The burn gave him something to focus on, a reminder that fire still existed in the world, even if no one wanted to share it with him anymore. That night, Barbara asked why he was late getting home. He said traffic. She believed it, or acted like she did. The kids were already in bed. The kitchen smelled like meatloaf. Normal things, warm things. He sat at the table and ate in silence, chewing slowly, like he was trying to remember what comfort felt like. And in his head, he thought, "They're cutting me loose." Not because he talked too much, not because he failed, but maybe because he was too good, too useful, too invisible. A tool that sharp eventually cuts its owner. He wasn't afraid. Not yet. But he understood what came next. The mafia didn't fire people. They erased them. And the Iceman had always known how to vanish. He didn't think twice when he first said yes. The man across the table had a badge, sure, but he didn't feel like a threat. Maybe it was the way he asked. Calm, patient, like he already knew. So Richard shrugged and started talking. The recorder clicked on, and something in him shifted. What poured out wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was cold, measured. A voice without tremble, without shame. He didn't flinch as he spoke about the man he'd shot in a car just to watch how fast the blood would pool. Or the one he poisoned slowly, watching him convulse over a plate of soup. The details didn't come like memories, they came like inventory. Like a man listing off tools in a garage. The detectives who listened later would say it didn't sound real. That no one could speak like that about death, not unless something was broken far beyond repair. But that was the thing. Richard wasn't broken. He was built that way. The Scorpio tapes, they called them. Hours of recorded confession. A killer pulling the curtain back without blinking. Not to brag, not for glory. Just telling, because someone finally asked. In one part, he mentioned a dog. Said he once used a stray to test a homemade poison. Watched it writhe. Took notes. Another time, he described tying a man to a chair with duct tape, then walking away for an hour before returning, just to see if the man had given up screaming. He had. There was no music on the tapes, no edits, just that voice, low and steady. He didn't raise it, didn't lower it. If a man had coughed blood into his hand, or begged to see his kids one more time, Richard reported it with the same tone he'd used to describe a grocery list. The cops leaned in. One of them, a veteran who'd seen bodies pulled from barrels and riverbeds, had to step outside. Said the air felt thick. Another just stared at the tape recorder long after it stopped, like it might speak again on its own. But Richard? He leaned back, asked for a sandwich, said his jaw was tired. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't relief. It was release. He'd kept all of it quiet for so long. Killed without names, buried without funerals, erased lives like chalk from pavement. And now it was out, not shouted from rooftops, not scrawled in letters just spoken, simply, chillingly. He even chuckled once on tape. Said the only real mistake he ever made was trusting people who smiled too much. They thought the tapes would close the case. They didn't know they'd opened something much deeper, something colder. Because long after the sentences were handed out, long after the interviews ended, the Scorpio tapes kept whispering, and every cop who heard them carried that whisper home. They were parked 3 blocks away in an ice cream truck that didn't sell a damn thing. One guy with binoculars, another with a clipboard. They never made a move, just sat there, pretending they weren't watching him. But Richard knew. He always knew. The first sign was the shift in the air. Friends who once laughed a little too loud now laughed a little too carefully. Conversations that used to wander suddenly stuck to safe, shallow ground. They'd talk about weather, kids, football, anything but names, routes, or late-night favors. Even his barber started asking fewer questions. And then came the sound. Click. Pause. Click. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. But Richard had spent too many years listening for the wrong thing at the right time. He could hear a wire's rhythm, hear fear in a throat trying to pretend it wasn't dry. One guy, Tommy, came over with a 6-pack and his chest tight like he forgot how to breathe naturally. Said he wanted to catch up. Richard offered him a beer. watched him fumble the opener like his hands didn't belong to him. Every word was rehearsed. Every laugh was fake. He was wearing a wire, the kind that feeds straight to a van with tinted windows and headphones too tight on some Fed's ears. Richard didn't call him out. He didn't have to. He just leaned in and asked if the beer tasted like betrayal. Tommy didn't finish it. There were vans now, more than one. They swapped spots like actors changing scenes, but not fast enough. Richard counted them, noticed when one stayed longer than it should, noticed when a jogger passed by 3 times in the same hour, but never broke a sweat. He started sleeping less, checking locks, leaving the TV on with the volume low so he could hear other things. He'd survived this long by knowing when not to move. Pressure does funny things. It doesn't always break you loud. Sometimes it just makes you quieter, more careful, more dangerous. Richard didn't lash out. He didn't run. He didn't start fires. He started remembering every detail, every name, every face that had ever crossed him, lied to him, shorted him. Because when the walls start whispering, the only defense is to whisper back louder in your own mind. And Richard's mind had sharp corners. He knew how this would go. They'd want him to panic, want him to slip, but he wouldn't. Not yet. Let them watch. Let them listen. Because surveillance works both ways, and Richard had been watching long before the vans showed up. He wasn't just under pressure. He was pressure. He walked into the diner like it was any other afternoon. Same boots, same jacket, same dead-eyed calm. But this time, he wasn't sitting down to eggs and coffee. He was meeting someone new. A guy who said all the right things, talked about money, contracts, targets, claimed he could use someone with Richard's particular set of talents. His name was Dominic, but he wasn't real. Not really. Dominic was an illusion built by the state, an undercover agent wrapped in leather, trying to look like a killer. He played it rough, threw around street talk, made casual threats over a slice of pie. Richard listened, watched, and then nodded slowly, like he was considering the offer. But deep inside, he already knew what this was. He could smell the metal in the air, the desperation behind the performance. Operation Iceman, they called it. Months of prep, wires stitched into jackets, transmitters stuffed in salt shakers, agents pretending to be executioners, trying to lure one of the deadliest men in America into admitting what they already suspected. But Richard? He was playing a part too. He told stories, little ones, big ones, some true, some twisted. He spoke in riddles, bragged about murders that had no dates, mentioned bodies in barrels, freezers, rivers. He painted pictures with his voice thick, cold, brutal. And Dominic, sitting across from him, played the role of eager partner. He asked questions. He nodded. He baited. Richard fed it to him. Spoonfuls of ice. At one point, he even offered a job killing a guy who owed him money. Said there would be 5 large in it. Easy work. Dominic nodded again. Said he'd think about it. Said he liked the sound of Richard's style. But that job was smoke. No one was ever going to die. It was a setup, the final play, a closing move in a slow game. The more they talked, the more Richard leaned in. He spoke of acid baths and cyanide sprays like someone else might talk about recipes. No nerves, no fear. And behind the mirrored glass, agents scribbled notes, adjusted headsets, whispered to each other that maybe, just maybe, they had him now. But Richard wasn't stupid. He never was. He saw the signs, knew when he was being hunted, and somewhere in that icebox of a soul, something started to crack. Not fear, not guilt, but boredom. He was tired, not of killing, but of the act, of pretending he was still invisible, of waiting for the knock on the door. So he let it play out. Let them record. Let them celebrate. He gave them their show. And when they finally moved in badges, cuffs, guns drawn, he didn't flinch. He just looked at Dominic, the fake hitman, and gave him the faintest smile. "You're not the first," he said. Then he added, almost kindly, "But you were the quietest." The sky was the color of old concrete when they came for him. Overcast, heavy, a quiet kind of gray that matched the moment. Richard had just finished running a few errands, some groceries, some nonsense, and was walking across the cracked pavement of a suburban parking lot. He wasn't in a hurry. He rarely was. His boots moved slow. His shoulders didn't twitch. The bag in his hand held milk, bread, and the soft lie of a man who looked normal. He didn't see the agents right away. That was the point. They waited until he was boxed in, near the back of the lot, between a weathered sedan and a pickup with rust on the fenders. One moment, he was alone. The next, they were all there. Badges flashed like lightning, voices sharp but controlled, hands on weapons but not pulling. He could have run, but where would he go? He could have fought, but for once, he didn't want to. Instead, he set the bag down gently. The loaf of bread tilted sideways. The carton of milk rocked and settled. He looked up at them, not angry, not afraid, just tired. A tired that had been creeping up his spine for years. Maybe it had started the moment he killed for the first time. Maybe it had never left. They told him to get on the ground. He didn't. He raised his hand slowly, like someone stretching in the morning. He said nothing, just stared at the lead agent, the one who had practiced this moment in his head 1,000 times. The man looked back, unsure for a second if they had the right guy. This wasn't a monster. This was a man with soft eyes and steady breath. They cuffed him without a struggle. Click, click, cold steel on warm skin. The agent read him his rights. Voice firm, rehearsed. Richard listened, not really hearing the words. He was thinking about the milk, probably already leaking through the paper bag, about how many bodies lay beneath rivers and highways, about how the end, when it finally came, felt more like silence than justice. No bullets were fired, no fists raised, just a man standing still, and a law that had finally caught up with a shadow. As they walked him to the unmarked car, a woman nearby glanced over, curious. She saw a man in cuffs, saw the agents, but she didn't scream, didn't run, just stared. And Richard, always aware, always watching, gave her the smallest nod as if to say, "It's all right now." The door closed behind him with a dull thud. For the first time in decades, he wasn't in control, and he didn't mind. The call came just after dinner. The kids had gone upstairs. The TV was still murmuring low in the background. Barbara picked up the phone expecting a neighbor, maybe her sister. But the voice on the other end was official, clipped, cold. It said her husband was in custody, and that was it. No explanation, no warning, just a wall that suddenly rose between her and the man she'd built a life with. She stood there for a while after hanging up, just standing, holding the receiver like it might still have answers if she pressed it harder against her ear. In the kitchen, the light above the sink flickered once, then settled. A pot of sauce on the stove had begun to burn, but Barbara didn't move. She had loved Richard, or at least the version of him she knew. The version who brought her flowers without reason, who held her hand through labor, who cried when their daughter broke her arm on the playground. That man could not be the same one in the mugshot she saw hours later, but he was. And that's what cracked her. They told her the list was long. Murders, dozens, maybe more. They said he had worked for the mob, that he'd used cyanide, that he'd watched life drain from men's eyes like it was just another Tuesday. They said it all with the tone of people who'd known for years. But Barbara hadn't. Or maybe she had just not all at once. Just in pieces she ignored. There were nights he came home late, smelling of something metallic. He said it was the shop, the reels, the chemicals from the darkroom. She believed him. She wanted to. The mind makes strange trades to keep the heart calm. But now, sitting alone on the edge of their bed, she felt everything tilting. She thought about the way he smiled at strangers, about how calm he was during storms. about how their freezer sometimes had locks she never questioned. Looking back, it wasn't one big lie. It was 1,000 tiny silences strung together, pretending to be trust. She saw him next from behind glass. He wore orange. He looked tired. She looked like someone who hadn't slept in a week. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time folded in on itself. They were young again. Just Barbara and Richard, the couple from Jersey. No shadows, no secrets, just a family and a future. But then, he looked away. That was when it broke. The betrayal wasn't about the blood. It wasn't about the murders or the mafia or the lies wrapped in silence. It was about the life he let her build around him. The birthday parties, the Christmas cards, the Sunday drives, all while knowing it was borrowed time. Barbara didn't cry in that room. She saved that for later, for after the glass and the guards and the clinking door. She walked out of that building and into a wind that felt colder than anything she'd ever known. Her husband had disappeared long before the arrest. She just hadn't seen it until now. It started with silence. Not the calm kind, the kind that hums too loud in your ears because everything that once made sense is suddenly missing. That was the first thing the kids noticed. Their father wasn't there. Not for breakfast, not for school drop-off, not for bedtime stories. And no one said why. Not at first. Barbara tried. She sat them down in the living room, hands folded in her lap like she was holding something broken. She told them their daddy had been taken away, that he had done bad things. But her voice cracked when she said it. Because how do you explain that the man who tucked them in every night also tucked bodies into barrels? The children were old enough to understand loss, but too young to understand betrayal. At school, whispers started. Other kids had heard what the news was saying, that their father wasn't just gone, he was a monster hiding in plain sight. A killer, a professional, a ghost who wore an apron at dinner and a silencer at night. They didn't know what to believe. They remembered the man who helped with homework, who cheered at recitals, who made pancakes shaped like animals on Sunday mornings. That man didn't fit the stories playing on television screens. He didn't fit the mugshot on the front page. He didn't fit the word murderer. And yet, every day brought a new piece of the truth. Teachers pulled them aside gently. Neighbors looked away. Reporters hovered too long on the sidewalk. Cameras pointed like weapons. Each article felt like a betrayal of memory. Each headline chipped away at what little was left of their innocence. Barbara tried to shield them, but she was falling apart too. She barely slept. She barely spoke. The house felt hollow, like someone had turned the volume down on the world. She started keeping the blinds closed, the phone unplugged, the television off. But silence had a weight of its own, and eventually, it crushed them. The youngest cried in his sleep. Nightmares of shadows without faces. The oldest stopped speaking for a while. Just stopped. Not because he didn't have words, because the words didn't make sense anymore. They started to ask questions. Not all at once, but in bits, in whispers. Did he ever really love us? Was it all fake? Are we like him? And Barbara had no good answers. Only half-truths, and the kind of pain that sits behind your ribs and refuses to leave. The family didn't break all at once. It cracked slowly, quietly, over months, over holidays that passed like ghosts, over birthdays where no one lit the candles, over moments when someone would laugh, then stop, remembering why they shouldn't. The man they called father had been both protector and predator. And now that he was gone, they were left with a puzzle made of sharp edges, a history rewritten in red ink. No hugs could fix it. No bedtime story could smooth it over. Because how do you rebuild trust in a house built on secrets? They didn't just lose a parent. They lost the story they told themselves about who they were, and nothing was ever the same again. The cell was small, but Richard didn't flinch. He had seen worse rooms. Hell, he had made worse rooms. Concrete walls, metal bars, a mattress thin enough to fold like paper, none of it surprised him. The cold didn't either. If anything, It reminded him of himself. Not winter cold, but that kind of quiet, creeping freeze that starts behind the ribs and never really leaves. He didn't cry, didn't shout, just sat on the edge of the bunk and stared at nothing. A man stripped of layers, no suit, no car, no gun tucked beneath the seat, just skin and bone and secrets. He didn't need warmth. He needed order, structure, a routine. The world had changed, but his mind hadn't. So, he adapted, like he always did. Mornings started early. Lights snapped on without warning. He rose without complaint, folded the blanket like a soldier, washed up with water that bit at his skin. He didn't talk much, didn't mingle in the yard. He wasn't there to make friends, and everyone sensed it. They gave him space, not out of kindness, but instinct. Something in him still hummed with threat. Even without a weapon, even with gray in his beard, there was a tension behind his eyes that said, "Try me." Some guards thought he was calm, others thought he was broken, but neither was true. Richard was still Richard, just quieter, slower, watching. Time in prison had its own weight. Hours passed like molasses, days dragged, but weeks they slipped by before you realized. He measured time in letters that didn't come, visits that never happened, meals that all tasted like regret. Yet somehow, he never lost his center, because inside, he had always lived in a cell. A cell made of memories, rules, and routines. This one just had steel walls instead of shame. The shrink tried, of course. They always did. Sat across from him with a yellow pad and too many questions. Tried to peel back layers, like they were talking to a wounded animal. But Richard wasn't wounded. He was built this way, forged cold, designed not to break. He told them what they wanted to hear, enough to keep them nodding, never enough to show what really lived beneath. Other inmates talked, bragged, told stories about what they did on the outside. Richard listened, but never joined in. He knew better. Words were dangerous. He had seen men die for saying the wrong thing, or the right thing to the wrong ear. He wasn't scared. He was prepared. He exercised, ate, read, slept, dreamt rarely, and when he did, the dreams were fogged in ice, no faces, just feelings, pressure, weight, a sense that something always needed doing, something that could never be undone. And through it all, he adjusted. Because that's what Richard did. Whether it was a family barbecue or a freezing meat locker, a Christmas morning or a contract hit, he blended. He shaped himself to the room, the moment, the need. Even now, in a place made of echoes and locks, Richard wasn't unraveling. He was studying, waiting, because ice doesn't melt quickly. It thaws, slow, quiet, and even behind bars, it still cuts. The lights in the room were too bright, not blinding, but sterile. A camera stared at him like a glass eye, blinking red. The interviewer sat just a few feet away, holding a notepad, pretending he wasn't scared. But Richard could feel it, the nervous flick of the pen, the tension in the man's shoulders, the way his eyes kept dropping to the exit. Richard didn't smile. He didn't frown either. He just spoke, calmly, clearly, like he was ordering a sandwich or describing traffic. Except what he was describing wasn't traffic. It was murder. It started small. A local reporter, someone looking for shock value. They didn't expect what they got. They expected a thug, a brute. Instead, they got a man who looked like your neighbor. A man who could talk about bloodshed while adjusting his collar, who could explain how to make someone disappear between sentences, about spaghetti sauce or childhood bullies. And people watched. The tapes spread. Before social media, before hashtags, before the world learned how to share in seconds. These interviews moved from one late-night rerun to another, whispered about in prison rec rooms, passed on VHS between curious hands. People couldn't look away. Not because Richard shouted, but because he didn't. There was no showmanship, no screaming, just facts, delivered with the chill of someone recounting the weather. He would say things like, "I shot him once in the head. He slumped. I went home." No flair. No remorse. That's what made it worse. Viewers didn't know what disturbed them more, the acts, or the way he could describe them while sounding like a school teacher. The experts tried to analyze him. Words like antisocial, psychopathic, detached, but none of them quite captured it. Because Richard wasn't a cliché. He wasn't twitchy or wide-eyed. He didn't brag, he explained. And every time he looked into the lens, it was like he was talking directly to whoever was watching. No judgment, no excuses, just truth as he saw it. In one clip, he said, "If I had not met my wife, I'd probably be dead, or I'd be killing more." Then he paused, looked straight into the camera. But maybe that's not a bad thing. The producers didn't even know what to do with that. Years later, when platforms would go digital and viral became currency, these tapes would explode. But even in the early days, they had power, chilling, unshakable power. People recorded them, rewatched them, passed them around like forbidden fruit. The Iceman, speaking from behind bars. As calm as a priest, as clear as a scientist, as cold as death, he never flinched, never looked away. And even when the questions got sharper, more personal, when they asked about kids or feelings or regrets, he kept his voice even. Maybe there were flickers behind the eyes, maybe not. But what people remembered wasn't any crack in the mask. What they remembered was the mask itself. Because some monsters don't roar, they just talk. The voice didn't rise, it didn't fall. It rasped through the room like sandpaper dragged across stone. Dry, rough, unhurried. Richard sat across from the microphone, shoulders loose, eyes steady. The guards leaned against the far wall, pretending not to listen, but everyone always did, because once he started talking, it was impossible not to. There was no grin, no flash of pride, but there also wasn't guilt. He spoke like a man, reading out a grocery list. The memories came one by one, stacked with precision, each one darker than the last, yet told with the ease of someone recounting a fishing trip. He would say things like, "The guy cried. I didn't mind. I let him finish," and move on without missing a beat. There was no tremble in his hands, no flicker in his eyes, not even when he mentioned the tools he used, not even when he described the way bodies dropped or twitched or stopped breathing altogether. People expected remorse, or maybe bravado. They got neither. Just a man shaped like a mountain, with a voice made of gravel, explaining the art of death like he'd once painted houses. Efficient, methodical, not personal. He was asked, more than once, if he ever felt bad, ever had regrets. He'd blink slowly, maybe tilt his head a little, like the question was in another language, then say something like, "No, it had to be done," and he meant it. This wasn't rage. Rage leaves blood on the ceiling and screams in the walls. This was procedure. And that's what chilled people. The calm, the stillness, the sense that, to him, taking a life was just another part of the day. Not enjoyable, not tragic, just necessary. But here's the twist he didn't gloat. There was no trophy shelf, no dark sparkle in the eye that serial killers get when they think they're impressing someone. Richard didn't want to impress. He wanted to explain. And his explanation was always the same. They gave me a reason. I gave them an ending. There were stories that could turn your stomach. The man in the garage who begged for his life. The partner who talked too much. The Mark who didn't see it coming because Richard had smiled at him seconds before. Each one told like it was just a fact, just a thing that happened. No laughter, no tears. And still, the tape kept rolling. Sometimes he paused. Not like he was searching for the right word, but more like he was waiting for the weight of the truth to settle in the room. Then he'd continue, dragging the listener deeper into a world where fear had no use and conscience had no voice. One interviewer once said, "You don't seem angry. Richard shrugged. I'm not. And that was worse than rage, because you can plead with rage. You can beg it to stop, but you can't reason with a storm that doesn't know your name. And you can't change the mind of a man who never felt anything to begin with. He told his stories in a tone so flat it became a whisper inside your head long after the tape ended. A voice like sandpaper that left no blood on his lips but stripped the comfort from your bones. No regret, no glee, just the echo of nightmares told with silence in their soul. They brought in doctors, professors, men and women with soft voices and sharp minds. They watched the tapes. They studied the interviews. They read every word he ever said from behind glass or bars or microphones, and still, they couldn't agree. What kind of man kills like that, and then calmly tucks his daughter in at night? Some called him a textbook sociopath, cold, unfeeling, built without the wiring for empathy, the perfect predator. No remorse, no fear, no connection beyond what he decided to fake. One expert said his mind was a frozen wasteland. Another said it was a locked room with the lights turned off and no one inside. But not all of them agreed. Some saw something else buried beneath the layers. A battered child, a soul bruised too early and too often. A boy who learned before he could read that pain comes first and love comes with fists. They wondered if Richard wasn't born a monster but carved into one. He'd said once that he felt nothing when he killed. But he also said he didn't like hurting animals, that he cried when his mother died, even though she had beaten him with broomsticks and burned him with spoons. So was that contradiction? Or just the last shreds of a man trying to remember what it meant to be human? He played both parts too well. He could be gentle. He could be terrifying. He could tell a story about cyanide and death, and then chuckle about a family barbecue like the two moments lived in separate universes. And maybe, in his mind, they did. The psychologists circled that question like vultures over something they couldn't define. Was he evil? Was he ill? Could trauma twist a man so thoroughly that he becomes machinery with a heart rate? Some pointed to his childhood with fingers trembling in pity. Others called that excuse-making. They said 1 million people had fathers like his. Not all of them turned into executioners. But that's the thing about monsters. They never wear just one mask. Richard wasn't drooling madness or twitching nerves. He wasn't curled up in the corner muttering to invisible ghosts. He was calm, polite. He said, please, and thank you. And when the moment came, he ended lives as if turning off a light. So the debate goes on. The doctors still speak his name in seminars and case studies. Was he broken or born this way? Did he lose something? Or was there simply nothing there to begin with? One expert, older now, once summed it up quietly. When you look into him, she said, you see your own reflection until it blinks without blinking back. And maybe that's what scared them most. Not that Richard Kuklinski was a monster, but that he could have been anyone. A neighbor, a coworker, a father, a shadow in line at the grocery store, a tragedy that learned to smile like a man. They rolled the tapes, over and over, the same room, the same man, the same low voice. No music, no edits. Just Richard sitting there in a prison-issued shirt, speaking like he was reading off a grocery list. But instead of bread or milk, it was names, places, methods, the kind of details that made grown men check their locks twice before bed. There was no shake in his voice, no hesitation, no flicker of guilt behind the eyes. He wasn't proud, but he wasn't sorry either. He simply was, and that was somehow worse. He spoke of cyanide like it was Windex. He talked about freezing bodies like someone might describe storing leftovers. He went into detail, chilling detail, not because he wanted to shock, but because he didn't understand why it would. Pain, after all, was just part of the job. People were problems, and problems, he'd say, got solved. The interviewers asked questions carefully, slowly. Some tried to push, others kept their tone soft, as if they were speaking to a cornered animal. But Richard didn't bark, he didn't snarl. He smiled sometimes, but it didn't reach his eyes. He answered every question the same way, like a man who had made peace with the darkness in his bones. They asked him about his first kill. He paused, not because he was haunted by it, but because he genuinely couldn't remember which one it was. He said there had been so many, too many to count. Some planned, some spontaneous, all final. Then they asked him if he ever felt bad. His reply came like a cold wind. No, they were not good people. He made that distinction often. Good people, bad people. But what made someone bad, in his eyes, was never fully clear. Owe money, threaten family, disrespect the wrong man? That was enough. That was justification. That was the green light. One time, they played a clip back for him, a tape of his own voice, describing a kill in a motel bathroom. He listened. He nodded. And when it ended, he simply said, "That sounds right." The tape circled through law schools, psychology programs, criminology lectures. People watched them with notebooks in hand and chills in their spine, not because of what he did, but because of how calmly he explained it. No anger, no glee, just purpose, function. And in a world that likes to paint killers with wild eyes and twitching hands, Richard forced a new image. A man who could end lives and still be home by dinner. A man who could tuck his kids in at night after putting someone else in a freezer. The confession tapes never screamed. They whispered. And that's what made them echo. Because when evil doesn't raise its voice, people listen closer. They speak in low voices now, the kind people use when stepping through memories that still burn. His kids groan, guarded, careful with their words. They don't shout, they don't cry on camera. But their silence is louder than any scream could be. One of them remembers the sound of keys jingling at the front door and thinking, "Dad's home, not the Iceman, not a killer, just Dad, the man who helped with homework, the man who once carried them on his shoulders through a snowstorm, the man who made pancakes on Saturdays and tucked them in with stories at night." That's the memory they hold in one hand. The other hand holds something colder. They say they didn't know. Not really, not fully. Maybe they caught whispers through walls or saw things in the trunk that didn't belong. But they were kids. And kids believe in bedtime stories, in safety, in good guys and bad guys. Their dad never fit neatly into either box. He was the shadow in between. One of them says she used to brag about him, told friends he was strong, told teachers he was a businessman, told herself he was good. Now she doesn't tell anyone anything. Another says the moment the news broke, it was like their last name became poison. Classmates stared. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Reporters called. He started walking with his head down, like he'd committed the crimes himself. But still there's love there. A twisted, aching kind of love. The kind that doesn't ask for forgiveness, because it knows it'll never get it. The kind that survives anyway. He was their dad. No matter how many bodies, no matter how many lies, that bond didn't vanish. It just froze, buried under layers of confusion and betrayal. Grief came slow. Not the loud, messy kind. The quiet, smothered kind that shows up at unexpected hours, watching an old home video, hearing a laugh that sounds just like his, walking past a man with his build, and for 1 second thinking, could that be him? They don't visit him in prison. Not anymore. Maybe once or twice, early on, when they were still trying to piece together how the man who rocked them to sleep could also strangle strangers in silence. But time passed. The shock hardened into distance. Now letters go unanswered, calls left to ring. Some wounds don't close with time, they just learn to hide better. And yet, there's always a pause when they speak of him. A hesitation. Like they're still trying to decide who he really was. Protector or predator. Victim or villain. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe they'll never know. What his kids say now isn't always about hate. It's about heartbreak. It's about being haunted not by what he did, but by the fact that he never let them in far enough to understand why. Because monsters under the bed are scary, But the ones who kiss you goodnight are worse. In the end, the Iceman didn't melt. But something inside him cracked. Not wide, not loud, but just enough for a whisper to escape. It came during one of those taped interviews, the ones where his eyes stayed flat and his voice never wavered. He spoke about murders like weather reports, like groceries, like chores. But then, something shifted. The interviewer asked a question he'd probably been asked before, many times. "Do you regret anything?" He didn't answer right away. That alone was strange. Silence was rare for Richard. Not because he rambled, he didn't, but because he always seemed to know what to say. This time, though, he paused, looked down, exhaled through his nose like a man carrying weight he hadn't admitted to yet. Then he said it flat and raspy, like gravel scraping across cement. "I wish I'd been softer with my kids. Not sorry. Not I regret the murders. Not I take it all back." Just that one sentence, and it hung there like smoke in the room. A quiet, unexpected admission from a man who once laughed about using cyanide as casually as cough syrup. He didn't cry. He didn't ask for forgiveness. But for a man whose life was made of iron and silence, that one line was a crack in the armor, a glimpse of someone who'd once held babies in his arms, even while plotting deaths with the other hand. He said he wished he'd hugged them more. Said maybe he could have been a better father. Not a good man, he never claimed that. Just better. And there was a sadness in his voice that didn't match the murders. It wasn't about the bodies. It was about bedtime stories he didn't tell, dance recitals he skipped, afternoons he spent working instead of pushing a swing in the park. He said he didn't want his kids to be afraid of him, even if deep down he knew they probably were. Not of what he might do to them, but of what he was, of what they might become because of him. He said he tried to hide it, tried to keep it all locked away in a place they'd never see. But monsters leak, even when they wear cardigans and kiss foreheads goodnight. When asked if he regretted killing, he shrugged, said it was just business. But when asked about his daughter crying after school, or his son walking past him like a stranger, he winced. "That stuff hurts," he said. "That stuff stays." For all the horror in his past, the only thing that seemed to truly haunt him was what he missed while pretending to be normal. The moments he could never get back. The tiny, quiet pieces of humanity he'd traded away for power and fear and paychecks soaked in red. He never asked for redemption, never expected it. But he admitted almost too quietly to hear that he sometimes dreamed of different endings, not for the men he'd killed, but for himself. For the family that once believed he was just a man in a chair, watching cartoons and sipping coffee. He said he wished he'd laughed more, held more, talked more, because in the end, the Reaper did feel regret, but only for the things that still had a pulse. He died in a hospital bed. Not in an alley, not on the wrong end of a job gone sideways, not even in a prison fight. Just quietly. In the fluorescent hush of St. Francis Medical Center in Trenton, New Jersey. It was March 2006. The world was still waking up to the idea of smartphones. Facebook was new. The war overseas had taken center stage, and Richard Kuklinski, the man who had once made corpses vanish like smoke, simply stopped breathing. It wasn't dramatic. There were no last words etched in steel. No gasping confessions whispered into the sterile sheets, just a failing heart. The same heart that had powered a life of freezing rage, of manipulation, murder, and compartmentalized tenderness it gave out. The man once called the Iceman melted into death, shackled at the ankles, a guard posted outside his door. Barbara never got to say goodbye. They had called her the day before, told her he wasn't doing well, asked if she wanted to come. She said no. Maybe it was a final act of defiance. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe it was just knowing too much for too long. Loving him had cost her nearly everything, including pieces of herself she still hadn't found again. So she said no. And when the machines began their flatline chorus in the early morning hours, Richard was alone. He'd always thought he'd die differently. Part of him expected to go out like some of the men he had ended, fast, bloody, and forgotten. Maybe in the trunk of a car, maybe on a cold slab somewhere in the Pine Barrens. But he lasted. Through prison, through interrogations, through interviews that turned him into a macabre celebrity. He became something else in those final years. Not just a killer, not just a father, not even a monster. He became a puzzle piece in the true crime machine, something between folklore and file number. The irony was thick. A man who had spent decades perfecting the art of making death untraceable couldn't escape his own. There was no mystery here, no cyanide, no duct tape. Just arteries, weakened by time and pressure, finally giving up. It was medical, mundane, and in a way, merciful. He didn't feel the cuffs on his ankles when it happened. Didn't hear the beeping machines fade out. He just drifted. A man who had taken so many lives simply lost his. The prison released a brief statement. Natural causes, they said. No foul play, no suspicious circumstances, just paperwork and a body bag. The headlines followed, of course. The Iceman dead at 70. Killer of hundreds dies in custody. Reporters rehashed the same old stories, the frozen bodies, the mafia contracts, the interviews where his voice scraped like sandpaper against the microphone. Talking heads asked if he ever felt remorse. Psychologists debated whether he was a born predator or a broken soul, but none of that mattered anymore. The man was gone. What lingered was quieter. A daughter staring at the floor, remembering the warmth of his hugs and the chill of what she later learned. A son, silent at the news, trying to square the bedtime kisses with the blood-soaked legacy. A wife or widow now finally exhaling. Not because she was free. That had happened the day he was arrested. But because there would be no more collect calls from prison, no more nightmares about the other shoe dropping, no more wondering what was true and what was just another carefully woven lie. In death, Richard left behind something strange. Not grief, not exactly. More like a vacuum. A strange, quiet space in which everyone who'd known him had to confront their own memories and decide whether those memories were lies dressed as love or love wrapped in horror, because he had loved them. There was no doubt about that, and that was the most disturbing part. That a man capable of feeding dogs, cyanide, and strangling strangers in parking garages could also be capable of warmth. He had smiled at family dinners, laughed at sitcoms, brought home flowers, played Santa Claus, and then he'd leave, slip into his other self, and return without a wrinkle out of place. He'd been two men all along, and now both were gone. There was no grand funeral, no procession, no mourners in long black coats. His body was cremated, scattered, probably, or maybe buried quietly under a numbered marker, lost in a maze of forgotten inmates. The state didn't say. The family didn't ask. He died like most men do, heart failure. But unlike most men, he left a trail behind him that would never truly fade. There were still detectives who kept his files in their desk drawers, still cold cases with question marks scrawled beside his name. There were old gangsters who still spoke of him with a strange mix of fear and respect, as if saying his name too loudly might summon him. And there were viewers, hundreds of thousands of them, who watched his interviews late at night, hearing the dead man tell his stories with that gravel voice and calm demeanor, wondering how real he really was. Some said he made up half of it, that the numbers were inflated, that the murders were padded to build a legend. Others believed every word, said you could hear the truth in the way he didn't blink, in the way he didn't gloat, in the way he described death the same way most men describe fixing a leaky faucet, just something that needed doing. But those debates never reached him. He didn't care, not anymore. The questions stayed behind, echoing in prison walls, in television screens, in the backs of people's minds. He had become a ghost long before he died. There's something eerie about a man like Richard dying in such a normal way. For decades, he had been a storm walking among buildings, a wolf in a winter coat, a weapon with a pulse. He knew fear. He used it like currency, and yet, His own end came without fanfare. No dramatic standoff, no blaze of violence, just beeping machines, then silence. Maybe that's the final twist. That the Iceman melted not in fire but in stillness. That the man who prided himself on control died in a place where he controlled nothing. Not the air, not the time, not even the door he would never walk through again. People ask if there was redemption, if the last years softened him, if prison cracked the ice. Maybe a little. He smiled more in those final interviews, laughed at himself once or twice, mentioned dreams that didn't involve blood, but he never apologized. Not really. Not for the lives taken, not for the horror caused. His only regret, if you can call it that, lived in the silence between words, in the way his eyes shifted when someone mentioned his family, in the way he admitted he wished he'd been softer, just not softer on the job. Richard Kuklinski died in 2006, in a bed, not a gutter, in silence, not sirens. The world barely noticed, but the shadows he left behind, they still haven't fully cleared. Under the buzzing hum of prison fluorescence, Richard Kuklinski sat in front of a camera, thick arms crossed, eyes unblinking. He wasn't trying to scare anyone. He didn't need to. The stories rolled out of him like smoke from a long-forgotten fire, matter of fact, precise, and with a chilling calm that made interviewers fidget in their seats. He didn't perform. He didn't embellish. Or maybe he did. But if he did it like a man who had forgotten the difference between truth and legend a long time ago. By the time Richard took his last breath in that New Jersey hospital bed in 2006, he was no longer just a man. He was a myth. A walking contradiction that nobody could completely explain. And when a story refuses to stay pinned down by facts, it grows legs of its own. That's exactly what happened. The Iceman didn't die. Not really. He just changed forms. The myth of the Iceman began before the interviews, before the documentaries. It started in whispers in precincts, in mafia back rooms, in courtrooms where bodies were spoken of but never found. A hitman who froze his victims to confuse time of death. A man who could poison without blinking, strangle without sweating, shoot without missing. A man who, some said, never got angry, just colder. And then came the tapes. When the world heard him speak for the first time, it wasn't the number of murders that shocked people. It was the tone. He talked like he was remembering errands, not executions. He didn't brag. He didn't flinch. He recounted killings like a plumber talks about fixing leaks. Just a job. Just something that needed doing. That's what made it unforgettable. Producers took notice. Journalists leaned in. Hollywood came calling. There were scripts floating around as early as the late 1990s. Movie studios flirted with dramatizations, some too gritty to get greenlit, others too cartoonish to take seriously. One screenplay made the rounds that portrayed Richard as a kind of anti-hero, a cold-blooded assassin with a tortured past who only killed those who deserved it. Richard would have hated that version. He never cared for excuses. He didn't paint himself as a moral man. He just did what he did and slept soundly. Most nights. Eventually, one film did get made. It was released years after his death. Michael Shannon played him with unsettling intensity, and critics noted the eerie accuracy of the performance. But even then, the movie version felt like an echo of the real man. A shadow, a dramatization. Not quite Richard, because how do you bottle that calm, that control, that switch between doting father and executioner? Some fans of the film said the real story was too unbelievable to be true. Others said the film understated how terrifying he really was. Then came the conspiracy theories. People said he worked for the government, that his knowledge of poisons and chemicals was too advanced for a street killer, that he had connections with intelligence agencies during the Cold War. Some even said he had been used to silence political enemies, though no proof was ever found. Others believed he was protected by certain branches of law enforcement for years, allowed to operate because he only targeted criminals. The devil you know logic. There were theories that he hadn't died at all, that the man who passed away in that hospital wasn't really him, that it was a double, that Richard had cut a deal, disappeared into witness protection, and was still out there, old and quiet, living in some small town under a new name. Of course, those theories never held up. But the fact that people wanted to believe them said something deeper. It said that the world wasn't ready to let the Iceman go. He had become an urban legend, the boogeyman in a suit, a man with a family, a barbecue grill, and a freezer full of secrets. There was something too neat about it all, too cinematic, too made for Netflix, and that's exactly why he endured. Documentaries continued to circulate. New ones came out every few years. Younger generations discovered him through clips, through memes, through late-night YouTube binges. He became a dark bedtime story, a case study in psychology classes, a cautionary tale for kids who thought monsters lived under beds, not in split-level homes with flower beds out front. Psychiatrists argued over him for decades. Was he a psychopath? A sociopath? A broken boy who grew into a broken man? Or was he something rarer, a hybrid, built by trauma, sharpened by necessity, and kept calm by cold calculation? He didn't fit cleanly into the usual boxes. That made him fascinating and dangerous. Richard once said that he never enjoyed killing, that it was always about the money. But even that statement got twisted in the myth machine. Some said it was a lie, that you had to enjoy it a little to be that good at it. Others believed him completely, believed that he was a machine built by pain, run on habit, incapable of remorse, not out of cruelty but out of disconnect. There was even a theory that he had faked some of his kills to inflate his legend, that he took credit for murders he never committed. But here's the strange thing. Even if some of that were true, it didn't weaken the myth. It strengthened it. Because now he wasn't just a killer, he was a master manipulator, even from behind bars, still dangerous, still pulling strings. In a world obsessed with true crime, Richard stood apart. He didn't have a tragic spiral like so many others, no drug addiction, no flashy arrests. He was methodical, quiet, a ghost in plain sight, a man who tucked in his children after spending the day dumping bodies. That duality was the hook. That was what made him unforgettable. You could imagine bumping into him at a grocery store, maybe standing in line at the deli counter, maybe holding a balloon at a birthday party. And that's what made the myth powerful. Not the blood, not the body count, but the normalcy wrapped around the horror. Hollywood tried to recreate that. They still try, but you can't fully capture the quiet menace of a man who kills and then makes cocoa, who smiles while recalling freeze-dried corpses, who talks about murder the way most people talk about mowing the lawn. Richard never called himself the Iceman. That name was given to him. He wore it like an old coat, didn't love it, didn't reject it, just accepted it. Because deep down, he knew it fit. Not because he froze bodies, but because of what he was inside. Still, calculated, always watching. Even now, years after his death, the story refuses to settle. New books, new documentaries, new theories. People search his name late at night, read his quotes, play his interviews, and wonder how much of it was real, and how much was just a man telling the best bedtime story he knew, the one where the monster looks like your neighbor. The answer might not matter, because by now, the Iceman has done what few killers ever do. He became a legend, one that doesn't fade, and that's colder than any freezer. The prison hallway was quieter than usual that morning. Nurses moved like ghosts. Guards didn't talk much. A fluorescent light flickered in the corner, the way they always do in places like that. No screaming, no clanging metal, just the low hum of machinery and the steady beeping of a monitor counting down toward silence. Richard Kuklinski lay still in that hospital bed, cuffed at the ankles, chained to nothing but memory. The man they once called the Iceman had gone cold in a different way now, organs failing, breath slowing, body worn down not by bullets or blades or blood feuds, but by time. Time got him in the end. Time always does. It was 2006. The early part of spring, the kind where the chill still hung in the air, not quite warm, not quite cold, a season in between, a fitting place for him to end. He did not die in a blaze of violence, no last-minute shootout, no vengeful rival kicking open the door, no gasping final confession. His death was slow, quiet, and undramatic. A heart attack, the same thing that takes thousands of people every day. But when it happened to him, it felt like something else, like a page turning in a book that everyone had read with white knuckles. Some say he never opened his eyes again once they sedated him. Others claim he mumbled something, a name maybe, or a memory. But the truth is, no one knows for sure. He slipped away the same way he lived his later years in partial shadow, not resisting, just disappearing. There were no guards panicking, no emergency code called, just a doctor checking his watch and a quiet acknowledgement that the Iceman was no longer breathing. That's how the Reaper goes when he finally meets his own. News of his death didn't explode. It crept. A small article here, a local mention there. Eventually the larger outlets picked it up, but by then it was already fading from the cycle. Another killer gone. Another monster buried. But this one left a different taste behind, because no one was really sure how to feel. For some, it was relief. For others, curiosity. A few even felt a strange kind of sadness, not sympathy, but that unsettled ache you feel when the last page turns and you still don't have all the answers. Barbara didn't attend the burial. His children didn't speak publicly. His name wasn't carved into a grand headstone or whispered with reverence. He was buried like a prisoner. No fanfare, no farewell, just earth and silence. But in the silence, something lingered, because Richard had become more than a man in the last years of his life. He had become a story, a shape in the dark, a bedtime warning. Don't talk to strangers. Don't trust the quiet ones. Lock your doors at night. Say your prayers. The kind of tale people tell not to forget what men are capable of, but to remind themselves that monsters can have mortgages and take their kids to soccer practice too. He had given interviews, hours of them, voice calm, details sharp, never proud, never ashamed, just there, telling it, like reading a grocery list, a narrative in grayscale. And people watched those tapes over and over, trying to decide whether he was empty or just exhausted, whether he was lying or just remembering more clearly than most people ever could. But now the camera was off. The mic was unplugged. The voice was gone. Sleep now. The Reaper is gone. There's no need to flinch at creaking floors or midnight sounds. The man who once dissolved bodies in barrels, who poisoned with burgers and froze corpses to fool coroners, who took orders from ghosts in mafia suits, that man is gone, and no one else will take his place. Not like him. Not with that strange, ice-thick calm. You're safe now. No more secrets muttered in prison yards. No more hidden caches of cyanide or whispered rumors about contracts left unfinished. The work is over. The tools are down. The hands that once squeezed out life without shaking are folded now. Still, done. And maybe that's the only peace a man like him ever gets. He will not haunt headlines forever. The world moves too fast for that. New killers rise. New stories replace old nightmares. But for those who sat across from him, interrogators, journalists, even cellmates, the image remains. That stare, that voice, that pause before he spoke, like he was scrolling through a dark library only he could see. But the books are closed now. There is a strange kind of ending in this. Not a bow-tied finale, not a grand reckoning. Just a final page that does not turn. Some say he got what he deserved. Others say he got off easy. But perhaps the truest thing is that he died the way he lived. Silent, cold, impossible to fully understand. You can stop looking over your shoulder now. He's not in the freezer. He's not in the basement. He's not out there waiting for the right moment. That fear, that fascination, it can go now. He is gone. Sleep now. No need to rewind the tapes. No need to ask if he felt remorse, if he loved his children, if he would have changed it all. The answers are buried with him, in soil and secrecy. Maybe it's better that way. And if, in the quiet of your room, you feel that old chill, the kind that comes with stories like his, just remember, the monster is still, the chain is locked, and the story has ended.